Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is let's start this from the beginning in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 26, The Festival I. Let's start this from the beginning. The Festival I. You will have more than enough time to run along with your friends later that evening, but your duties as my son come first. But Ota-san dash. This is no discussion, Sasuke. His father's loud voice almost made him flinch. You're old enough to participate in such events now. Your mother and I already gave you more leeway than what is considered normal, but you can't stay hidden forever. Your brother joined us when he was 2 years younger than you're now. He then continued in a somewhat softer voice. You're not expected to stay all night. There will not be much for you to do anyway once everyone sits down to eat and talk, so I'm not averse to you sneaking out after an hour or two, but you will do your duty first. Sasuke lowered his head with a muttered agreement and kept it that way until his father had left the kitchen. It was almost funny how he had always wanted to join the grown ups when they came together at his family's house for a private celebration on this day of the year, only to be actually disappointed when he was finally expected to do so. What were the odds of that happening that one time he actually had plans of his own for that day? Usually, he and the other children of his clan were sent away to play with each other and have fun, which were just polite ways to make sure they didn't bother anyone. With that in mind, Sasuke hadn't expected that it would be a problem when he told his father that he planned to meet some of his friends from the academy to join the public celebrations of the village. He had been excited about that day for weeks now, looking forward to exploring the various stands and join the games, only to be stopped at the last minute. To think that he had been jealous of Itachi all this time. Oh, how stupid he had been. Thinking about his brother. Don't be so gloomy. The time will fly by in a wink of an eye and you will be free to go before you know it, you will see. But the others will already have done everything by the time I join them. I will miss all the fun. Itachi had the gall to chuckle at that, making him glare at his brother in response. I think you underestimate how much there is to do. You would not be able to take part in as much as half of the available attractions even if you joined your friends from the very beginning. And that's already excluding the ones you can't join because you're too young. He frowned, his annoyance momentarily forgotten. But there wasn't that much when Kaa-san took me with her. It might seem this way because you were too young to participate in much, Itachi said before standing up. Believe me, there will be more than enough left for you and your friends to do once you're allowed to leave. His brother had no reason to lie to him about that, so it was probably the truth. Sasuke was just about to stand up himself and thank Itachi for cheering him up when sudden pressure against his forehead made him fall back on his ass. You better behave until you're free to go, though, Itachi said with an amused smile, his right hand still raised from his previous move. Ota-san might change his mind otherwise. Realizing that Itachi had poked him again brought his scowl back to his face in full force, but he was gone before he could complain about it. I will stop him from doing that one day, he thought as his scowl morphed into a pout. Or even better, I will be the one that pokes him. Finally, Izumi thought with a relieved smile. Took me long enough, though. The object of her attention was the simple necklace with 3 silver rings in her hand. It wasn't her first attempt, but it was the first one that Itachi might actually like. All her other pieces had been way too elaborate and embellished. He might have still worn them to be polite, but she knew for a fact that he wouldn't have liked them very much. He was more the type for simplistic things. At first, she had been absolutely clueless about what she could get him. You didn't become Jonin every day, after all, so it should be something special, right? Now, a necklace would usually not be called special either, but a self-made one? That would do. Izumi allowed herself a second to think about what she would get when she finally got promoted as well, but couldn't think of anything. Hana was too random of a person to predict what she would give her, and the same could be said about Shisui. Itachi, on the other hand, always managed to surprise her, so she didn't even try to predict his present. They were her only close friends, so whatever she would get from her more casual acquaintances would be just normal stuff. Well, not that it mattered much. She became a Chunin just a few months ago, so the possibility of promotion was still far in the future. Oh, is that for Itachi? She was proud to say that her first reaction was to jump around and slash at the intruder with a kunao she had quickly summoned to her hand. "Hey, hey, hey," the intruder Shisui exclaimed while jumping back. "Watch where you point that thing. You could hurt someone with that." She huffed but reluctantly put the weapon away before placing her hand on her hips. "Of course it's sharp, that's the point." She narrowed her eyes at him. "And what did I tell you about sneaking into other people's houses?" He just rolled his eyes good naturally. Yes, it's rude and I will not do it again." "You say that every time, yet it happens time and time again." "But this time I'm serious." "Maybe that would be more believable if you wouldn't grin like an idiot while saying that." "Whatever," she muttered with a sigh. "Why are you here this time? You're not hiding from Mikoto-san again, are you?" "Can't I just visit a friend I haven't seen in a long time?" "We saw each other just 2 days ago," she said with a deadpan voice. "You know, when you came here to hide from Mikoto-san." 2 days are a long time," he protested while dramatically grasping his chest. Then, before she could reply, he took a step towards her to give the necklace she had abandoned on her table a closer look. "Oh, nicely done. Simple but with a dash of elegance. Itaka will like it." He gave her a questioning look. "It is for him, right? Because it would suit you as well." She rolled her eyes at him. "Yes, it's for Itaka. You know that I'm not a fan of jewelry." Yet you wore some when you met that boy last week," he said teasingly. "So, how was your date?" For a moment, she was too surprised to answer. Then that surprise turned into indignation. "How do you even know about that? You were on a mission at that time." Shisui snorted. "There is little that goes on in the village that I don't know about." He apparently wanted to leave it at that, but her glare made him reconsider. "I overheard Mikoto-san talking about it with your mother. Seems both of them think you looked adorable, in case you wondered. Now tell me, how did it go? Do I need to hide a body?" Of course they would gossip about that, she thought while suppressing a grimace. She had actually tried to keep her date a secret exactly because she knew she wouldn't hear the end of it for a long time. "I'm more than capable of hiding a body myself, thank you very much." That made him chuckle. "Just trying to be chivalrous, you know." "Can I assume that it didn't go well, then?" He was an idiot, just like any other 12-years-old boy, she said resigned before letting herself fall into her bed. "Honestly, I don't know why I expected anything else. You're all the same." "I take offense on behalf of all 12-years-old boys," he replied in mock seriousness. "And why are you including me in this all of the sudden? I'm 15, not 12. She shrugged. "Whether you're 12 or 15 makes hardly a difference, does it? Not like you matured in that time or anything. You're breaking my heart, you hear me? My heart. And if even I am affected by your words, what would Itaka say if he hears you saying something hurtful like that?" "So you disagree?" No, the answer came without hesitation, making her snort in surprise. "Doesn't mean it's a nice thing to hear. Boys have emotions as well, you know." "Could have fooled me." She sat up again. "Anyway, what did you get for Itaka?" He grinned. "Can't tell, it's a secret." Then, seeing her annoyed frown, he started to laugh. She tried very hard to keep her face annoyed but failed miserably, feeling her lips tucking upwards against her will. Staying in a bad mood was almost impossible with a person as cheerful as Shisui around. It's good to have a friend like him. In hindsight, Jiraiya should have used a henge to hide his identity after leaving his sensei's office, but he had been too deep in thoughts to think about it back then. And who could blame him? After such a long and exhausting conversation, everyone would be elsewhere with their mind. It wasn't as if he didn't understand why he couldn't go after Nagato and Konan yet, he truly did, but that knowledge didn't make it any easier to actually listen to the old man. After all, wasn't he their sensei? Wasn't it his responsibility to look after them? He had already failed Minato and Yahiko, could he do the same to them? Just like he apparently did in an alternative timeline? He understood that confronting them too early could end catastrophically. The odds were that he would die fighting them again even though he had a much better grasp on their abilities now. As much as it increased his chances, it was not easy to gauge whether or not he could actually win, especially because he wouldn't accept help from others for this. Not only that, but pain was also very valuable to Madara and his plans. While it was relatively unlikely that he would interfere in a fight, there was no way to predict how his plans would change if pain was taken out of the equation this early. Of course, the entire point of using their knowledge about the future was to change it, but that needed to be done carefully. They needed to find the right balance between changing things and preserving enough to still have an idea of what's gonna happen. And then there was the entire thing concerning his newest intel about Orochimaru. Needless to say, his mind was elsewhere while he walked through the streets of the village. Unfortunately, even as distracted as he was, he noticed all the fingers that were pointed at him and the eyes that burned into his back. He was used to attention, especially from the female part of the population, of course, but too much was too much. That was one of the reasons he didn't want to come back to Konoha too often. He was a loyal shinobi of the Hidden Leaf and would gladly sacrifice himself for his home, but he preferred to protect it from afar. Much less stressful that way. However, that wasn't an option any longer. He had a godson that needed to be looked after, and while he couldn't just let all his duties fall to the sideline, the least thing he could do for Minato's and Kushina's son was to regularly visit him. Make sure he was alright and all that. Jiraiya hadn't done too good of a job with that last time, and he didn't intend to make that mistake twice. Speaking of which, Ero Sennin. Distracted as he was, he hadn't even felt Naruto close by. Because of that, he had not much time to react before a yellow flash, what brilliant wordplay, crashed into him. He instinctively steadied the body when he felt the boy cling to him, putting his two tiny arms around his torso to capture him in a hug. Naruto, he laughed, his gloomy thoughts from before forgotten. I'm just as happy to see you as you are, but would you let me go? People are already staring. Not every day one of the legendary Sannin got jumped at by a child, after all. Thankfully Naruto did as he was told, a rare enough occurrence in and of itself. He didn't stop beaming at him, though. I didn't know you were back in the village. Why didn't you come to say hi? I just returned today, he said while starting to pull him along the street to get away from all those people. I hoped to be here for your birthday, but I was a bit too late for that. Sorry. Nah, it's alright. Anyway, the old man was there and talked to me some, and Senja-chan came too. He thought. Senja. I knew there was a reason I liked her best of all the people that work at his orphanage aside from her ample build. Oh, I also made a new friend. Oh? A friend or a little lady friend? Are you finally just a friend? I already told you to not be so pervy all the time, Ero Sennin. Yeah, he said as he rubbed the spot where Naruto had kicked him, even though it was mostly for show. I got it. Just a friend and nothing more. So, what's their name? Naruto immediately stopped to frown. It's Sasuke. He's from the Uchiha clan and his mother and brother are really nice too. His father is a bit strict, I think. Sasuke Uchiha? Really? He couldn't help but wonder if Itachi had arranged for that to happen. What were the odds of them befriending each other all on their own again? And how is the academy so far? Do you get along with everyone? Anything you struggle with? He shook his head. Everyone is pretty cool. The girls are really annoying, though. They always gather around Sasuke during breaks and make it impossible to talk to him. He laughed loud enough to startle several people near them. That's the curse of good looks, my boy. I had the same problem when I was in the academy myself, you see. Well, not that you would understand something like that. Hey, are you calling me ugly? No need to be sad about that, Naruto. Just give it a few more years and the problem will go away all by itself, I promise. You are calling me ugly, aren't you? Naruto launched a kick in his direction that he easily sidestepped, ignoring it as if it never even happened. Don't dodge. I dash. Oh, would you look at that, he interrupted the boy. Isn't that the place you always want to eat at? Come on, it's my treat today. Do you think you can? He blinked. Hey, that's Ichiraku's. Let's go, Ero Sennin. Stop dawdling, we need to hurry before there is no seat left. Jiraiya didn't bother suppressing his chuckle at how predictable the boy was. Honestly, how he could inherit something strange like an obsession for ramen from Kushina was a mystery to him, but he didn't mind. It was kinda adorable to watch, really. Stupid old man, daring to order me back like that. Shizun forced herself to keep up her smile instead of groaning in frustration, but it became harder and harder with each passing minute. I'm sure the Sandaime has very good reason to dash. His reasons be damned. Only her years-long experience of dealing with her mentor stopped her from flinching at that outburst. I said I would never return to that place. I can't believe I'm even considering it when I should just ignore that stupid letter. What is he gonna do? Arrest me? If you remember, that's exactly what he writes he is going to do if you ignore him. Tsunade snorted before she emptied another glass of sake and called a nearby waiter to refill it. And how does he plan to do that? Send some pesky jonin? The Umbu? Please, it's not like they're a threat to me. Maybe you should just read the rest of the letter yourself instead of dash. You read it, didn't you? Just tell me what else the old man wrote. Shizun took a deep breath to stop herself from snapping at her. This was serious, no matter how nonchalant Tsunade was about this, and she wouldn't be able to continue this conversation if she lost her cool. It states that he will send Jiraiya-sama dash. Ha! As if that old womanizer has it in him to actually fight me. And put someone else in charge of Konoha for the time being to come himself as well. Fortunately for her sanity, that made her pause. He will come himself. She shook her head. There is no way he would leave Konoha just to bring me in. No, this must be a bluff. Do you think he would really do something like that? Because Shizun didn't. She might not know the Sandaime as well as her mentor, but that seemed seriously out of character. Apparently Tsunade thought so as well if her silence was any indication. Even so, she wasn't sure that would be enough to convince Tsunade to go. Her mentor was unfortunately too stubborn for her own good most of the time. It would be well in character for her to just risk it and ignore the summon only to try to run away once it became clear that this time there would be consequences. To be completely honest, she was surprised that the Hokage had let her run free for as long as he did. Everyone else would have long since been declared a Nukenin. However, this letter proved that his patience was finally at an end. Well, she thought. I guess I need to play dirty if I want to make sure that she doesn't make the wrong decision. I would like to visit Konoha, you know. Tsunade threw a sharp glance in her direction, her eyes showing no sign of dizziness that would be present in everyone else that had as much alcohol in her blood as she. Where does that suddenly come from? You never mentioned something of that sort before. Shizun shrugged. I knew you would have never agreed no matter what I say. Why bother bringing something up when you already know the outcome? It was the truth. It had been many years since she had seen her home and she missed it. Not enough to leave Tsunade's side for a visit who knew what kind of trouble she would land in without her to rein her in at least a little bit, but enough to keep her awake from time to time. What do you even want there? Tsunade's voice was much more subdued now, sounding almost nostalgic as she buried her head in her arms on the table in front of her. It didn't take a genius to know what, or who, she was thinking about. There is nothing dash. It's still home, she interrupted her gently while putting a hand on her shoulder. Of course I miss it. I know you do too, even if you would never admit it out loud. Besides, it had been years since you have spoken to your sensei or even Jiraiya-sama. They surely miss you as well. Wouldn't it be nice to meet them again? All she got for a reply was an uninformative humming noise. Our visit also overlaps with the anniversary of the Yondaime's defeat of the Ninetales, she added. There are yearly festivals and celebrations on that day, remember? Think about all the food, the alcohol, the games. Tsunade snorted. Now you're just trying to manipulate me. Well, is it working? The other woman stayed silent for a few minutes before she finally sighed. I guess it does, she said, sounding something between resigned and amused. Next destination, Konohagakure. Chapter 27, The Festival 2. Let's start this from the beginning. The Festival 2. Itaka slowly backed away as he blocked Sasuke's attacks with one hand while keeping the other one behind his back. You make too many unnecessary movements, he said. Don't try to look graceful while you attack and worry more about actually hitting me. The only reply he got was a frustrated growl. Chuckling briefly, he casually tilted his head to the side to avoid a kunai that flew at him from behind. A second later, another figure joined the fray by trying to sweep his legs away. Sasuke apparently saw his chance when Itachi took a step aside to dodge the new attack and chose to jump at him with new ela to take advantage of this supposed distraction. Needless to say, he continued to block Sasuke's axe kick with one arm while using the other one to redirect another punch from the newcomer. Not bad, Haku, he told the girl with a smile, completely unaffected by their combined attacks. But if you ambush someone stronger than you, you need to make your first attack count. Otherwise, the attempt is wasted. She didn't reply, choosing to continue her attacks rather than waste her breath by talking with him. Also, he continued with an amused smile. If you fight together with an ally, you need to make sure that you complement each other rather than stand in the other's way. To demonstrate that, he grabbed Haku's leg when she sent another kick at his head and threw her at the incoming form of Sasuke, making them fly into each other before they fell to the ground in a mess of limbs. The smile on his lips grew a bit wider when he saw the two glares sent in his direction. Well, one glare and one slightly miffed glance. Haku wasn't one to glare at people, after all. Now, why don't we dash? Surprisingly, he was forced to abandon what he was going to say in favor of jumping away to dodge several shurikens that came flying towards him from three directions, shot by what he assumed must be traps one of them had set up in advance as neither of them was able to use a clone technique yet. It didn't stop there, though. Rather than landing on sturdy ground, he needed to adjust his balance to stop himself from falling when his feet made contact with solid ice. Itachi had not much time to think about that as just a moment later, Sasuke came sliding in his direction, intent on kicking his feet away to throw him to the ground. Reacting on instinct, he spread his legs and allowed Sasuke to slide underneath him before tilting his head to dodge another kunai thrown by the boy when he noticed that his attack had failed. Now standing with his legs wide apart on a surface of ice, there wasn't much he could do when Haku's silhouette swam through the ice until she was below him before jumping out of it. He just barely avoided the punch to his face by a mere millimeter before he raised his arms to block her incoming legs. However, rather than attacking him, she used his body as a springboard to jump away from him. Furthermore, she also grabbed something from the air and then pulled. It took him a moment to realize that it was wire. It must have been attached to Sasuke's kunai, and by the time that realization set in, the person at the other end of it came crashing directly into him, catapulted by the force of Haku's pull. The impact sent him flying, throwing them both for several meters before they landed on the ice and skidded for a few more. When they came finally to a stop, Sasuke was lying on top of him with a wide smile. "Ha! We got you, Nii-san," he exclaimed happily before turning back to look at his comrade. "Did you see that, Haku? We won." The girl opened her mouth to reply, but then the world began to shift and the ground beneath them collapsed, letting the three of them fall into nothingness. A moment later, Sasuke and Haku found themselves hard breathing on their knees in front of him while he looked down on them with an amused smile and a raised eyebrow. "I believe I remember telling you that this would be a taijutsu bout," he said. "That usually implies that ninjutsu isn't allowed." Neither of them answered for a while as they tried to get their breathing under control. It was Haku who recovered enough to speak first. "When did you cast the genjutsu?" "The moment we arrived on the clearing, of course." Sasuke made an indignant noise. "But that's cheating." He sent his little brother a look that could be translated as, "Are you serious?" making him blush in embarrassment as he realized what he just said. Still, he continued when he saw their crestfallen faces. "Your strategy was very well thought out. Making me believe I won before starting a well-coordinated surprise attack that made clever use of the environment is not something most academy students would come up with. Well done, you two." That seemed to cheer them up a bit. "To be honest," Haku said with a shake of her head, "I was really surprised when it actually worked. We should have noticed something was wrong by then." "Ah, whatever," Sasuke replied confidently. "We will get him next time." Itachi chuckled. "Maybe you will. But first, there are 2 lessons that you can take with you from today. Can you tell me what they are?" Both mulled about it for a few seconds before Haku spoke up. Not letting yourself be unknowingly caught in an illusion. Almost, he said with a smile, but not quite. It's impossible to avoid something like that all the time. It's much more about being always aware of your own chakra to notice whether you're in a genjutsu or not. While most shinobi aren't good enough to create very realistic illusions, meaning it's enough to be attentive of your senses and environment to notice if something is amiss, it's never wrong to be a bit paranoid about such things. He gave them a few seconds to think about that before he continued. And the second one. Both thought about it, their faces set in frowns as they considered and discarded possibilities, but neither could think of anything else. Not that he had expected them to, of course. The thing he was thinking about was only indirectly related to the situation, after all. The second lesson, he said when it became obvious that neither of them would say anything, is to choose a more private location to plan a strategy than the living room, especially if it's the living room of the person you're targeting. Both their eyes went wide at that while their cheeks flushed red, making Ataka chuckle some more. You know, your plan might have actually worked if I hadn't known about it beforehand. He turned towards Haku. It was clever of you to keep the progress you made mastering your Kekkei Genkai a secret from me. On that note, congratulations on improving your control over ice to such an extent. Did the scrolls you got from Hokage-sama prove helpful? Just like every other village, Konoha collected as much information about the bloodlines of the other villages as they could to prepare for them to the best of their abilities. Unfortunately, they didn't have too much about the Yuki clan from which Haku descended, but there were some old reports, mainly from the First and Second Shinobi World Wars. Nothing specific, unfortunately, but even just reading about what was theoretically possible for her to do helped Haku in her ongoing attempts of mastering her abilities. They did, she said. I'm still far from where I want to be, but I'm getting better. Man, Sasuke groaned. I wish I would awaken my Sharingan soon to have a Kekkei Genkai as well. I'm sure then we could beat you. Although he didn't let it show on his face, that comment made his good mood evaporate. His brother didn't know about the requirements of awakening their Sharingan, of course, so it was understandable that he would say something like that, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to hear him doing so. Personally, he hoped it would be a long time until that day came. It was probably too much to hope that it would never come at all. Zabuza was glad that the revolution went as smoothly as it did and that they even were already in the process of forming an alliance with another village, he would admit that much. However, what he didn't like was that it was he who was forced to accompany some annoying diplomat to the Hidden Leaf village. His specialty was killing and maiming, not protecting. Not to forget that he would also need to stay polite all the damn time they were here, which was just a pain in the ass. Seriously, just because Kisame decided to go rogue barely a few weeks before they finally killed the Yondaime, that woman decided that it would be good for their image if he were the one that went on this mission. Something about showing the world that Kirigakure still had one of the 7 ninja swordsmen in its ranks, or something. It made him somewhat regret his decision to support her ascent to become Mizukage. Just a little, though. Mei was still the best choice, no matter how much he disliked the idea of that stupid bitch being able to command him around. He just knew that she would never stop holding that over his head. Never. At least they were allying themselves with Konoha and not one of the other villages like Kumo. From what he had heard, they were currently trying to get as many bloodlines as possible from other villages, which to him just screamed trouble. The Land of Water had had enough problems related to Kekkei Genkais to last for a lifetime and no need for even more of that sorts, thank you very much. Welcome to Konohagakure. If you would please follow us, we will bring to directly to the Hokage. Afterwards, we will accompany you to your accommodations. Zabuza almost snorted at that but kept his expression neutral until their guide turned around to lead the way. Figured they wouldn't let us walk through their village by ourselves. Tsunade resolutely didn't look in the direction where the pictures of the former Hokage hung. Seeing her grandfather's and granduncle's carved faces had been nostalgic enough as it was. Combined with the general conflict of being in the village again after all these years that she felt even now, she had no desire to make it even worse. You have grown old. And you look like you haven't aged a day since you left. Care to tell me your secret? She snorted. I don't think so. She then looked at her former sensei with a raised eyebrow when he took another puff from his pipe. A good first step would be to stop smoking, though. Might do your health some good as well. Ah, alas, I can't do that. Although he said that, he put the pipe aside. You wouldn't begrudge an old man one of the few pleasures he has left, would you? You're free to do as you please, she said with a shrug. I'm not gonna stop you if you want to land yourself into an early grave. At this point, it would hardly be an early grave, Tsunade. That's not the point and you know it. He chuckled. Yes, I know. I guess I should better look for a successor, then. She immediately tensed up at that remark. If you called me back because you think I dash. No, he interrupted her gently but firmly. I didn't do that to ask you to become Hokage, don't worry. You're hardly suitable for the job in the first place, even if we ignore your own opinion of that position. He gave her a pointed look as if daring her to disagree, but she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. All modesty aside, she was more than qualified for the position if she ever were to make an effort, regardless of whether she liked it or not. However, that didn't mean she would ever want to become Hokage, or agree to do so if asked. Well, it's good that we can agree on that. She leaned back into her chair, once again relaxed. With that out of the way, don't you want to offer me something to drink? And where is Jiraiya? I would have thought that idiot would be here as well. As if he had just waited for her to bring it up, the old man opened a drawer and took out a bottle of sake. I hope this is still your favorite brand. It was quite expensive and I would hate to have wasted so much money. Money is never wasted on sake, sensei, she said with a grin. But I can reassure you that it's indeed still my favorite. Good. He filled 2 glasses. And regarding Jiraiya, well, he was supposed to be here, actually. I guess something important must have come up that keeps him away. She snorted before drowning her glass in one go, enjoying the burning sensation of the alcohol as it ran down her throat. We both know exactly what's keeping him. It was probably too much to ask that he had changed over the years. Though she would never admit it, the thought of him being the same old goofball she knew in her youth was somewhat reassuring. Usually, I would agree with you, her former sensei said with an amused expression while he sipped from his glass. However, I think this time might be a bit different. Oh. He planned to spend the day with his godson today, you see. Naruto tends to be somewhat clingy, so I wouldn't be surprised if he somehow convinced Jiraiya to invite him for dinner or something like that. Maybe even train with him, if he was persistent enough. She blinked. His godson? Since when does he have a godson? No one in their right mind would entrust him with the welfare of a plant, let alone a child. Then she realized something else. And isn't Naruto the name of the main character from Jiraiya's book? Not to forget, isn't it also an ingredient in ramen? Who would name their child after that? Minato always looked up to him, he replied mildly. It shouldn't come as a surprise that he chose his sensei to be his son's godfather. You would know all that already if you had stayed in contact over the years, of course. She ignored the second part of that comment and instead focused on the other half. Minato. She suddenly jerked her head around to stare at the picture of the yondaime, only to regret it a moment later when she also saw her 2 deceased family members. She quickly turned back around. He had a son. He nodded. Indeed. I don't think I need to explain to you that this secret can't leave this room, do I? She nodded, still a bit stunned, even though she found it a bit stupid that Jiraiya would openly spend time with the boy if his identity was meant to be a secret. So I assume he is also Dash. He is. Heh, isn't that something? It was probably better that no one knew about either the boy's heritage or his identity as Jinchuriki. Being the granddaughter of the Shodai Hokage as well as the grandniece of the Nidaime meant that she knew a little something about all the attention family members of famous shinobi needed to endure. It would be better for him to grow up without that. Whether being the host of the Nine Tails would make things better or worse was everyone's guess. She sighed before deciding to change the topic. Anyway, she said, that's probably not what you want to talk with me about and I doubt you just wanted to catch up. Why don't we get the unpleasant things out of the way first? He nodded. That's fine with me. He then drowned the rest of his drink before leaning forward, interweaving his fingers with each other as he put them on the table. However, I think you already know why I ordered you back, don't you? I might have an idea or two, she agreed. But I hope that I'm wrong. It would suck for you if I came all the way just to remind you that I will not come back. Ever. And yet here you are. She resisted the urge to smash the table into 1,000 pieces and instead refilled her glass. We both know that this is not the same. I don't plan to stay long. She gave him a stinky look. Besides, it's not as if you gave me much of a choice in that matter. He tilted his head. I would say that I'm sorry, but that would be a lie. So, what now? Are you gonna do the same again? Threaten me to keep me here against my will? Though she didn't outwardly show it, her muscles tensed while she waited for his answer. Depending on what it was, she would not hesitate to jump out of the window and make a run for it. It was doubtful she would actually be able to escape, especially with Shizun in tow, but she stood a chance if she just somehow managed to get away from her former sensei. Even as out of form as she was confident she could take everyone in the village aside of him and Jiraiya, so she just needed to get enough distance between them and... I will not force you to do anything, Tsunade. Everything is alone your decision. She didn't relax at that promise. So you hope to convince me instead? Rather than to reply immediately, he looked at her for a few seconds before he visibly deflated. There will be another war soon, Tsunade. Not today, not tomorrow, not even in the next few years if luck is on our side, but the day will come sooner than I would like. This war will be different than the last ones, and we will need every little bit of help we can get. She snorted. You did well enough without me during the last one, didn't you? I don't see dash. Thousands are dead, he interrupted her. Countless more are crippled, and everyone has lost someone. She put her glass back on the table before she could shatter it in her grip. Don't you dare to lecture me on lost loved ones. Dan and Noeka will always be missed, he said, ignoring how she flinched at the mention of their names. But there are countless people that are still alive and suffer, either because of their own injuries or because of the ones of their loved ones. The number of medicnen, especially good medicnen, has decreased ever since you left the village and dash. And now you want me to save the day for you. She chuckled, though the sound was far from joyful. Unfortunately, my career is over. Shizun was my last student and that she will remain. She made to take her drink again, but his hand stopped her. I remember you telling me that you want to cure all sickness in the world when you were younger. That you would find a way to heal all and every ailments and injury one day. Did you truly give up on that? Dreams are foolish, she said while she felt her chair's handle crack under her left hand. They will never come true. Thinking otherwise will only end in disappointment. So you're fine with letting people die that would have lived if you just helped them. They wouldn't be dying if they just never became shinobi in the first place. Is that your excuse? He asked. Will you tell yourself the same once Konoha and all the other villages lie in ruins, burned to the ground, and are erased from the map? Who knows, maybe my grandfather was wrong in founding the village. The world might be better without them and their kind. For a few seconds, he looked deep into her eyes before he sighed and leaned back, finally letting go of her hand. In that case, I have nothing else to say. So surprised at his sudden turnaround, she even forgot to be angry. What? That's it? You're giving up just like that? I told you that I would not force you to do anything you don't want, he said with a shake of his head. At this point, there is nothing I can say that would make you change your mind, so there is no use in even trying. There was no way he would let it go already, she was sure of it. Hesitantly, she reached for her glass and slowly allowed herself to relax while somewhat anxious waiting for what would come next. So, what now? He hummed. Well, I'm tired. This conversation was more exhausting than I thought, so why don't we continue this tomorrow? You will stay here for the festival, I assume. The fact that he didn't look disappointed at all at her answer made her even more suspicious. I plan to, yes. Then why don't we three get a drink together with Jiraiya and catch up for real? It's one of the few days I can get away from work and I would love to spend the time with my students. She stopped herself from narrowing her eyes at him when she gave her consent. There was something else going on, that much was obvious, but she didn't think it was a trap. Not really. At least not a harmful one. Maybe it would be smart to avoid whatever he was scheming, but she would lie if she said she wasn't curious. And, well, Shizun wanted to stay for the festival anyway. She deserved this treat after all the trouble Tsunade had caused her. Who knew? Maybe she would even meet Jiraya's little godson. See whether the poor boy was already corrupted by that idiot of a teammate or if he could still be rescued. It would be a lie if she said she wasn't looking forward to it. Chapter 28, The Festival 3. Let's start this from the beginning. The Festival 3. You haven't changed in the slightest, have you? Her words could easily be misunderstood as criticism considering she said them as a reaction to him staring after the serving girl, but her voice and the smile on her lips proved that she was more amused than anything else. Oh, Kmin, the man in front of her whined in an overly dramatic fashion. Give me some slack, will you? We're celebrating our reunion. Allow me to have at least some fun. Their sensei chuckled. That doesn't excuse that you pay more attention to every woman that walks by than to your team, Jiraiya. Then he turned towards her. Though, as you said, he hasn't changed in all these years, so it's probably better to just let him be. I doubt you would prefer him gawking at you instead, would you? Tsunade snorted before taking a sip from her drink. Even a thick-headed idiot like he is smart enough to understand the consequences should he dare to do so. Indeed, Jiraiya added with a big grin, and as I think you would prefer to leave this fine establishment intact at the end of the night, it's probably better for me to study the other guests here instead. Sitting with her former sensei and teammate like this. She could almost forget that she was in a place she had sworn never to set foot in again. All that was left was Orochimaru, sitting opposite of her and looking at them disapprovingly while hiding his amusement at their antics, and it would feel as if she traveled back in time. Well, Tsunade, Jiraiya said. I'm sure you must have some stories to tell after traveling all these years. Say, how many debt collectors are after you these days? She rolled her eyes at him, but she had apparently already enough alcohol in us to not mind his jibe about her famous losing strike. Where to begin, where to begin? Oh, I know. She let out a loud laugh before starting to regale them with her tale. She might not necessarily be happy to be back in Konoha, but if it allowed her to enjoy evenings like that, well, maybe it wasn't all bad. She might even stay a bit longer than she had initially intended. Sasuke really didn't know why he ever thought it would be great to be allowed to these kinds of events. While his father said that he was old enough to participate, he now knew that what he truly meant was that he was simply too old to stay away. That, in turn, did unfortunately mean that there wasn't anything interesting to do for him. He couldn't even listen to some interesting conversations because the adults started to change the topics as soon as he came close. If he needed to listen to one more woman telling him how much he had grown or how much he started to resemble his mother, he could not be held responsible for what would happen. And the worst? He wasn't even allowed to go around on his own. Instead, there was always either one of his parents or Itaki around to keep an eye on him. Seriously, he was little more than a piece of decoration. At least they considered Shisui a responsible enough guardian to leave him alone with the older boy without a second thought. It was much more enjoyable to be with him because he wasn't forced to go around and entertain their guests like the rest of his family. It was also much more entertaining. Do you see the one over there? He looked towards the man Shisui was pointing, trying, and probably failing to be just as subtle as he. What Sasuke saw was a middle-aged man with a big belly at the buffet that his mother had prepared with several other members of their clan. That is, Takahashi. Shisui chuckled. Takijimi, but close enough. His name doesn't really matter anyway. You see, a few years ago during your brother's 5th birthday, he ate a lot and had a little bit too much to drink as well, so he threw up all over the table. Seriously. He knew that adults sometimes acted stupidly when they drank too much alcohol, and why did they even do that? That stuff was gross the one time he had sneaked a sip, but that it made them also throw up was new to him. Seriously, Shisui confirmed with a big smile. He almost hit your mother, actually. It was fortunate he didn't, of course. I doubt she would have forgiven him, and you really don't want to be on her bad side. That thought was similarly amusing as it was terrifying. Even his father avoided her when she was really angry. And he still gets invited. While these celebrations were technically open to all members of the clan, he knew that there were a few people that would not be welcome if they bothered to make an appearance. He didn't know the reasons, though, because no one was willing to tell him. Well, he's a pretty important figure, Shisui said as he furrowed his brows in consideration. On that note, I take back what I said earlier. His name does matter and you should absolutely remember it. He might not be a shinobi, but he has a very high position in Konoha's merchant guild. There are even speculations that he will become its head very soon. They had talked about the structure of Konoha just a few weeks ago at the academy, so he knew that this was a pretty big deal for a civilian. Don't worry, Shisui said reassuringly. I'm sure your father will soon start to teach you things like who is important and who is not. You're getting old enough, after all. Now that we're finally some good news. Then he would at least do something more than just standing around and look like a good little boy. Sasuke had a sudden thought. Hey, Shisui, did Nii-san ever do anything embarrassing? He found that idea hard to believe because he was always so frustratingly perfect, but there must be something, right? If someone would know and be willing to tell him, it would be Shisui. Going by his chuckle and the big grin on the older boy's face, his thoughts were pretty spot on. Oh? Don't tell me no one ever bothered to tell you about the time dash. Please refrain from telling my little brother one of your fairy tales, Shisui. He almost jumped out of his skin by the sudden sound of his brother's voice, but Shisui didn't seem surprised. What do you mean with fairy tales? I will let you know that everything I say is the truth and nothing but the truth. You mean like the time you told Izumi that you would go on a year-long mission that turned out to last only 2 weeks? Oh, come on. I was only teasing her a bit, that's different. Which resulted in her not speaking to you for nearly a month. Shisui mumbled something under his breath, but even Sasuke could see that he was only acting annoyed. I still think she was overreacting. I mean, it wasn't impossible that something unexpected could happen that would prolong the mission, right? His brother chuckled. I'm afraid that's not how this works. Still. Shisui straightened up and he thought he might have made some silly pose if they weren't still at the party in sight of most of their clan. Do you think it's fair to keep the story of when you did you know what from your brother? Your own flesh and blood? He deserves to know. Yes, he instantly chimed up. Come on, I want to know. Please, Nii-san. While he hated to act childish, he decided that this was worth it and put extra effort into widening his eyes and pouting his lips. Itachi grimaced, the gesture so minuscular that it would have been missed by everyone who didn't pay very close attention to him, though the fact that he even reacted as much as that meant that his strategy was working. You don't need to dash. Are you seriously going to deny your precious Otauto something? Shisui exclaimed in mock surprise. Who are you and what have you done to Itachi? It's for his own good. Before he could argue that point, another voice spoke up. I see the three of you are amusing yourselves, at least. Sasuke thought these surprises were getting old even while he jumped around with wide eyes, coming face to face with his father. Ah, I was just telling Sasuke some stories, Fugaku-sama, Shisui said with a smile that was much more polite than everything he had seen from him the entire evening so far. In fact, I just wanted to dash. Leave and get something to eat, Itachi seamlessly chimed in. I recommend my mother's casserole, by the way. It's delicious. His father spoke up before Shisui had the chance to reply. Really? And here I was thinking he was about to tell the story from when you dash. Ota-san, please don't encourage him even further. Fugaku's lips tucked upwards upon hearing Itachi's somewhat exasperated tone, but to Sasuke's disappointment said nothing more about the incident everyone aside of him appeared to know about. Instead, he turned towards him. You have behaved exemplary these last few hours, Sasuke, he said genuinely. However, I'm sure you're growing tired from listening to boring grown-up talks, so you're free to go and meet your friend now. Yes. He immediately regretted throwing up his arm in such a childish fashion, but no one seemed to mind. In fact, Itachi and Shisui smiled amusedly while his father chuckled and ruffled his hair. How many of your friends are going to be there? Let me think for a second, he said with furrowed brows. There is Naruto, of course, and Kiba, Shino, and Koji said he would convince Shikamaru to come as well. His father nodded. 6 altogether, then. In that case, you're allowed to stay out with them till midnight as long as you're at least 3 people. Under no condition are you allowed to walk around on your own, do you understand? Of course, Ota-san, he said eagerly. It wasn't as if they planned to split anyway, so he felt it alright to just ignore the last part. He waved him off. Then run along now and have some fun. Sasuke didn't need to hear anything else before turning around to walk away as fast as he could without looking hurried, ignoring the chuckles of the 3 family members he left behind. Who cared if they found his behavior amusing? He was finally getting away from this boring celebration, of course he would hurry. The evening had only just begun, after all. I still say it's unfair. While Naruto ignored Koji's outburst in favor of admiring his new short-sleeved haori and letting his hands wander over the red flame-like motifs on the edges of the white fabric, Shikamaru didn't. Just let it be, he said with a tired sigh. What's done is done, no need to cry over it. Koji disagreed. But I would have won. It's not fair that they didn't allow me to participate, not fair at all. It would have been even more unfair if they allowed an Akimichi to take part in an eating contest. Honestly, Naruto though. It's not as if they even had an haori in his size, so what is he crying about? Not that he would ever say that out loud, of course. His friend was rather sensitive about his weight and he didn't want to be chased through the village by an angry Koji. I think we passed a strongman game just a few minutes ago, Sasuke spoke up, audibly annoyed by the other boys whining. I'm sure that some of the prizes must be sweets, so why don't we dash? That's it. Koji exclaimed with fire in his eyes. Strongman game, here I come. He instantly turned around and rushed in the direction Sasuke had pointed at moments earlier, either trusting that they would follow him or just forgetting that they were there in the first place. Well done, Shikamaru said dryly with a pained expression on his face. Now we have no other choice but to follow him. There is no stopping Koji once he gets motivated. Sasuke shrugged with a self-satisfied smirk on his face. Still better than listening to his complaints. Besides, there was a shuriken stand close by that I wanted to test out, so it's not like it's a complete waste of time. Seeing his lazy friend still looking like he would prefer to be literally anywhere else than here, he decided to say something that he was sure would brighten his mood. Hey, wasn't that the one that had this fancy shogi set? While he tried to hide it, he knew Sasuke well enough to recognize the glint in his eyes as he realized his plan. Yeah, you're right. But I think it was one of the rarest prizes, so you would need to score really high to get it. Shikamaru rolled his eyes. You will need to be more subtle when you try to manipulate someone. This was just painful to listen to. However, he started to walk in the direction Koji had vanished without further complaints and with a straight back rather than his hunched posture from before, so Naruto counted it as a win. Hey, what did I miss? Turning around, he saw Kiba walking towards them, his arms filled with a wide variety of food while Akamaru followed closely on his heels. He was just about to open his mouth to reply when another voice from beside him made him flinch in surprise. Nothing much, just Koji running off to play a game while Naruto and Sasuke tried to manipulate Shikamaru. He shot a glare at the side of Shino's head, annoyed that the other boy had managed to make him jump like that and angry with himself that he had forgotten about his presence entirely. In his defense, it was easy to forget about him with how little he talked. You did what? Kiba laughed, a wide grin spreading over his face. You really tried to trick Shikamaru? Are you stupid? Akamaru barked in agreement. Well, it worked, didn't it? Naruto crossed his arms. Why did they make fun of them when their plan clearly worked out just as intended? I guess, Kiba said with a shrug, though he still spotted a grin. So they walked ahead, then. He blinked. What do you mean? Aside from Koji, all of us are dash. He broke off in the middle of the sentence when he turned around and found everyone aside from him and Shino missing. What? Where did everyone go? They went ahead to play the games. He jumped around, pointing directly at Shino's face. Without us? Why didn't you say anything? The other boy just looked at him, completely unbothered by his accusation. Or at least he thought he was unbothered, it was hard to say with how most of his body was covered up. Why? Because I thought you knew and just wanted to wait for Kiba. I would have told you had I known you were this inattentive, Of course. He growled at that, but Kiba spoke up before he had the chance to explode into Shino's face. Hey, Naruto, where did you get that Haori? His bad mood evaporated almost immediately. Hehe, it was the first prize in the eating contest I won. As if anyone could beat him in something like that when the food in question was ramen. Seriously, people were stupid sometimes. Here, look what else I got. A second later, Kiba let out an amazed wow as he saw the three-blade kunai in his hand. Damn, this one looks much cooler than all those cheap copies they sell at each corner. He wasn't wrong. It wasn't surprising that there were so many stalls that sold stuff that was inspired by the Yondaime, considering the entire festival was held in remembrance of his victory over the Ninetales, but most of it was rather bland and cheap. While countless children were running around in a white Haori, with blonde wigs, or with kunai similar to the one in his hand, only a few of them could compete with his. He didn't even need a wig because he was already blonde. So, Kiba continued while the three of them walked towards where their friends should be. I guess you're not interested in even more noodles if you just came from an eating contest, so dash. Naruto pulled the aforementioned food out of his friend's hands, knowing that he was just teasing him. In your dreams, idiot. Kiba took a step towards him, ready to insult him right back. They both found it fun to fight each other both verbally and physically and started trouble with each other all the time without any hard feelings being involved, but Shino seamlessly stepped between them. We should hurry to catch up with the others. The play is starting soon and I don't want to miss it because you two started another fight. He pouted a bit at that, but a quick glance at Kiba confirmed that he was just as unwilling to risk missing the play as he was, so they silently agreed to postpone their fight for now. Besides, Shino was creepy. He had no idea how he was able to make such a terrifying glare when you couldn't even see his eyes, but it was almost as creepy as Mikoto Obasan's smile when she found out that he and Sasuke had accidentally burned down half of the kitchen when they wanted to bake a cake for his brother's birthday. Yeah, no one liked to disagree with Shino. It just wasn't worth it. It always amused him to watch this play. The content itself wasn't funny, of course, with it being a recollection of the night 8 years ago that almost destroyed the village and ended with the death of the Yondaime and his wife. It was a somber affair, one that brought more than just one person in attendance to tears. After all, everyone had lost somebody that day. However, he still found amusement in the fact that over a dozen shinobis, professional killers that didn't hesitate to commit grievous crimes in the name of their village, used their skills for something banal as this, whether it was a fire technique that sent tightly controlled flames over the heads of the audience, a water technique to create mist for a gloomier atmosphere, or the transformation technique that created an imitation of the Ninetales that could have been mistaken for the real deal if it weren't for its smaller size. The shinobi used everything in their arsenal to give the people a good show. Still, for all that it amused him, he also found happiness in the fact that techniques that usually brought nothing but death and destruction were used in such a harmless way. It gave him hope that shinobi might one day become more than just simple killing machines. However, in his opinion, it would have been much easier to simply use a genjutsu to create all of this. However, from what he had heard from his mother, his father had been soundly shut down when he proposed just that a few years before Itachi had even been born. There were quite a lot of shinobi who enjoyed using their abilities for something more harmless than murder, apparently, and they didn't want that taken from them. He could understand that sentiment. Besides, it was probably better to do it this way. There was no way many shinobi would be comfortable with letting themselves caught in an illusion like that, even if they knew that it was ultimately harmless. Not being able to notice what was going on around them for a prolonged amount of time while in public just wasn't something people in their profession liked to experience. Again, he could understand that sentiment. Funny, isn't it? Izumi whispered from beside him. If you weren't there on that day and just watched this play, you would have no idea how terrible it actually was. Itachi wasn't sure if she was talking to him or just to herself, like the absent look in her eyes hinted at, but he decided to reply nonetheless. They can hardly show how people got killed in masses, now can they? That wouldn't get over very well. The most gruesome scenes, if they could even be called that, were the ones where some attack from the Ninetales swept a number of actors out of sight, probably in an effort to make the show more child-friendly. She snorted and gave him a small smile before turning around once again to watch the play. No, probably not. He kept looking at her for several more seconds before he nodded to himself and did the same. Itake had been a bit worried when she had proposed to come here since she had always avoided it the previous years. Not that he could blame her, she had watched her own father die during the Ninetales attack and had consequently little interest in watching a play about that day. However, she seemed fine now, which he accepted as the positive sign it was. They applauded together with the audience when the actor that played the Yondaime killed the Ninetales by thrusting a kunai through its head. Barely anyone knew how exactly he had beaten the Biju, so the actors let him win differently every single year, making it the most interesting scene by far, and kept their silence when the play ended with the Yondaime's death. There was absolute silence as the body crumbled to the floor before vanishing underground by clever usage of the hiding like a mole technique. Everyone stood like that for a minute, paying their respect to the fallen hero and everyone else that had died in that tragic night with lowered heads, only the occasional sob cutting through the silence. Then the fireworks started, signaling the end of the morning minute. The change in the mood of the people around him was impossible to miss. There were oohs and ahs left and right, laughter from every direction, and cheerful calls as people joked with their friends and families. It was easy to notice that many were still sad and downcast, but everyone did their best to brighten the mood. They celebrated because they were still alive and because it would be rude to the dead to fall into depression when they had given their lives for them. They celebrated because looking forward was the only thing they could do to repay this debt, and because they owned it to the fallen that they went on with their lives and didn't lose themselves in grief. It was truly beautiful. Once the firework was over, their group, consisting of him, Izumi, Shisui, and Hana, moved on. They simply walked through the streets with no clear goal in mind, the latter three going ahead while he was a few steps behind. While that didn't let him avoid teasing comments from Hana, "Gosh, Itake, how do you manage to look prettier in a kimono than Izumi and I?" Entirely, it at least saved him from being pulled into participating in games by Shisui. He had honestly no idea what he and Izumi enjoyed about goldfish scooping. With their skills, there shouldn't be any challenge in that. Relaxing and enjoying the simpler things in life was one thing, but this must surely be boring? At least Izumi had the common sense to give the fishes she won to a small child rather than keeping them. Kokuben might not be a common crow and would understand her if she told him not to eat them, but he might just as well decided to do it anyway. However, Itake conceded that he enjoyed watching the others play silly games while he stood at the side, enjoying whatever sweets had caught his eyes. He didn't allow himself to eat too much unhealthy food aside from the semi-occasional dango, but this night was an exception. A team effort from all his companions ultimately forced him to participate in a simple game that was targeted at shinobi and required the participants to create certain images with their shuriken. Now, had he played against other children, he might have held back to keep things fair. However, as the only other participants were Hana and Izumi, he paid them back for making him play it in the first place by getting the first place. He had no regrets. Itake had unfortunately no use of the pink necklace he got as his prize, as he already wore Izumi's present for his promotion around his neck, so he gave it to Shisui instead, who then wore it with pride in full sight over his blue kimono. It was not too long after midnight when he finally proposed to find his and Hana's younger siblings and their friends. They would doubtlessly try to stay out as long as they could no matter how tired they might be, so it was better for them to bring them home rather than risk them falling asleep in some abandoned alley. Also, there was something else he needed to do before the night was over that he needed one of his brother's friends for. The appointed time was still a bit away, but it would be bad if he couldn't meet the deadline because they needed to search for them for too long. This worry was fortunately discarded when he heard a voice from behind him. "Nii-san. Chapter 29, The Festival 4. Let's start this from the beginning. The Festival 4. Kmin, Sasuke. There is really no need to sulk, is there? I don't think I am such bad company." The younger boy at his side threw Shisui a gloomy look. "You are not," he said. "And I'm not sulking." "Could have fooled me," he chuckled, his amusement growing even more when Sasuke's reaction to that was turning around to hide his obvious pout. "If I didn't know any better, I would think you dislike being with me." "That's not it." Oh, Shisui knew all too well what was bothering the younger boy. It wasn't that Sasuke disliked being with him, but that he disliked not being with his brother instead. That Itake decided to accompany Naruto, who was Sasuke's best friend, home first before joining them made things even worse. It was stupid to be jealous about silly things like this, Shisui thought, but neither of the brothers was ever logical regarding each other. I'm sure Itachi will hurry and catch up with us soon, he consoled the boy. You understand why he went with Naruto, right? It can be dangerous to be out alone at this time of the night, and I don't think you would want your friend to be hurt, do you? Of course not. Sasuke exclaimed, clearly offended by that question. Well, then you have no reason to be sad about it either. Sasuke huffed. You could have taken him home too, you know. Then Nii-san would be with me now instead. Shisui dramatically clutched his chest with an exaggerated gasp. What? And here I thought you just said you enjoyed my company. How am I to endure the pain of this betrayal? All I said was that you aren't bad company, not that you're good company. However, while that sounded a bit harsh, the twinkle in his eyes and the small smile on his lips made it clear that he was only joking. Oh, now I see how it is, Shisui said. Well, in that case, there is no reason for why I should teach you this super awesome technique like I planned to. I guess I will just go and teach it to someone else, then. Maybe Naruto would be happy about it, don't you think? Sasuke snorted before grinning up to him. You can't manipulate me that easily, Shisui. Besides, I can just ask Nii-san to teach me something. I bet he knows much cooler ninjutsu. Ah, yes, he would probably teach you something as well, Shisui agreed unperturbed. However, what will it be? A kick-ass technique like the one I would teach you, or a much less impressive but more safe technique like the one Itachi would show you? After all, he can't let his little baby brother get hurt, right? Sasuke blinked. That dash. Furthermore, he said while throwing one arm over the other boy's shoulder and pulling him closer before continuing in a conspiratorial tone. You can't use only the things he taught you in your spars against him if you ever want to beat him. As long as he knows everything you're capable of, you will never truly catch him by surprise. With a technique taught by me, on the other hand, you might actually win one of these days. This was all it took to make Sasuke completely forget about how much he missed his brother. However, while he had successfully distracted him from it, Shisui couldn't help but get curious himself about what his friend was up to. Yes, letting a child wander around on his own was indeed a tad too dangerous, but that didn't explain why Taka needed to be the one to accompany the boy. He even declined Izumi's offer to do it herself. Sure, his whispered argument that he was not actually bringing Naruto to the orphanage but his godfather, and why was the boy even in the orphanage if he had a godfather, explained it somewhat, as the other children would only get jealous if they found out their friend got to stay outside longer than them, but it didn't quite satisfy Shisui. Whatever, he thought. I will just make him tell me later. I bet it's something interesting. Although some aspects of this Naruto were quite different from the one that had existed in the previous timeline, others remained still the same. His ability to lighten the mood wherever he went fell into the latter category. He and Sasuke had been friends for a while now, meaning Itachi had had the chance to observe the boy more closely than he had ever been able to before, and in that time, Itachi didn't think he had encountered a single person who disliked him. It wasn't like he was friends with everyone, of course, and there were a few people that were annoyed by his antics for sure, but no one actively disliked him. This time observing him meant Itachi now understood better than ever why he had been able to trust Naruto with Sasuke's fate after his own death, and he was glad that his meddling hadn't changed this aspect of his character. Tonight's plan would have been impossible to pull off if it had. Hey, Itachi, Naruto said, sounding more curious than he had previously when he regarded him with a tale of his latest prank. Why are you even here? Sasuke said you were at your family's fancy party and didn't think you would be able to leave. He chuckled softly. Well, technically I never left, you see. What? Naruto looked at him with wide blue eyes, confusion written all over his face. But you did. You're here now, aren't you? I did, he agreed. However, another version of myself did not. Then, when he realized that Naruto still didn't understand what he was implying, he continued, you know the Bunshin no Jutsu, right? Now he understood. So you used a clone to stay back while you sneak out and have fun? That's so cool. However, just a moment after the words had left his mouth, he frowned. Wait, Aren't the clones fake? They're only illusions, right? How comes that nobody notices that? You're correct, Itaka said with an approving nod of his head. And I'm sure your teacher at the academy will be glad to hear that you actually pay attention to his class from time to time instead of thinking about your next prank. And to answer your question, the technique I used wasn't the Bunshin no Jutsu but a variant of it called Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. It creates real copies of yourself instead of fake ones like the former one, making it perfect for situations like this. Naruto blinked. Wait, there is actually a way to create clones. Like, real ones? That's amazing. Why did no one tell me about that earlier? I want to learn it. Can you teach me please? Itaki regarded the boy for a few seconds. While he certainly had the chakra reserves to use it already, he wondered if it would be wise to teach it to him. After all, he was still rather young and could do a lot of damage if he went out of hand with it. Stuff that was nothing but a small, harmless prank now could quickly evolve into something that would be a problem. On the other hand, it might also become quite useful in the future. And then there was also to consider that Naruto still struggled with the normal Bunshin no Jutsu, meaning that teaching him the advanced version would give him an alternative he would need for his graduation at the latest. Naruto was unfortunately not very talented in terms of chakra control, so the odds of him mastering the basic technique weren't all that great. I have some conditions before I agree to teach it to you. Of course. I will dash. He raised his hand to stop the boy. You might not like what I have to say, so listen to me first and make your decision afterwards. Naruto looked a bit annoyed but grudgingly nodded his consent. If I teach you the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, you must promise me to not use it for your pranks. Naruto immediately opened his mouth to complain, but Itaka just ignored him and went on. And secondly, you will not use it to skip school by sending one of your clones there in your stead. Do you agree? The boy looked a tad annoyed about these limitations, but to his pleasant surprise, he didn't try to argue with him about them. Yeah, fine. I agree. You promise? Yes, I promise. Itaka narrowed his eyes. If I find out that you lied and used them for either of these two reasons, I dash. I said I promise, didn't I? Naruto interrupted him with a frustrated growl. I never go back on my word, so if I say I will not use it for that, I won't. They kept glaring at each other for a few more seconds before Itaka let the facade fall. That's good, he said with a smile. In that case, I will teach you. Let's hope I don't regret it. It would be a lie to claim that she wasn't enjoying herself, and while Tsunade was great at lying to herself, she saw no reason to do so right now. Not that she would ever confess that out loud, of course, Jiraiya would never let that go if she did. However, that didn't stop her from leaning back in her seat with a drink in her hand and a smile on her lips as she watched her old teammate and sensei banter just like in the good old days. Coming back to Konoha after all these years had been simultaneously easier and harder than she had expected. On one hand, once she made the decision to return for a short visit, she had surprisingly little hesitation to actually go through with it. On the other hand, seeing countless reminders of the life she had left behind no matter where she went was just as painful as she had thought it would be. Although in the end, she couldn't say she regretted coming here. As much as it pained her to admit, she had missed her childhood home. For every painful memory, there were a dozen good ones. In fact, even some of the things she had dreaded for years turned out to actually be a welcome sight, the Hokage Monument being a prime example. While not the majority, Tsunade had had more than one nightmare that involved her family over the years, and when she arrived at Konoha yesterday, she hadn't even been able to look at their pictures at the wall on her sensei's office. Today, however, she spent several hours looking at their stone faces, and honestly, it was a relief. She didn't think she was ready to look at their pictures yet, but if she was lucky, that too could change before her departure. It would be really nice to see their faces again to refresh her memories of them. Maybe she should look for some pictures of her parents as well when she was already at it. However, as much as she enjoyed watching Jiraiya make a fool of himself and no matter how much it eased something inside her chest to see her sensei smile in a way that made him look at least a decade younger than he actually was, she was neither oblivious nor stupid. Jiraiya might think himself subtle, and maybe he was when he really tried, but he couldn't fool Tsunade that easily. She freely admitted that he might have succeeded if she hadn't been suspicious from the very beginning. After all, there was no way that Sarutobi-sensei would simply give up on bringing her back as fast as he did, but as it was, she had noticed several strange things about his behavior. For one thing, he didn't drink quite as much as he should have. That wasn't to say that he didn't drink at all or even just a little bit, of course. The amount of alcohol in his blood would surely kill a lesser man. Tsunade was familiar with her former teammate, however, and thus knew that he could drink much more than that. This late in the evening, after several hours of drinking, he should be not only tipsy but drunk. And then there was also the fact that she had caught him looking at the clock several times already. Now, that alone wouldn't be too suspicious in and on itself. Unlikely as it was, he might have had other obligations this evening. The truly strange thing was that every time he checked the time, he would also look out of the window as if he was looking for someone. Tsunade was neither oblivious nor stupid. She knew when someone was planning something, and in this case, she was clearly the object of whatever was going on. Sensei doesn't let anything on, of course. She snorted. No surprise there. Jiraiya was always the idiot of the group, after all. Maybe that was a bit too cruel, but whatever. She wasn't known for mincing her words anyway, and as long as she only thought them, nobody would even know. Anything funny? She blinked, needing a second to realize that it was her Jiraiya had addressed. You mean something other than your antics? Well, he said with a silly grin while puffing out his chest. I am very entertaining if I may say so myself. However, I didn't say anything that would have made you snort, so there must be something else. Care to share it with the class? She casually swirled her glass with one hand while considering that for a few seconds before deciding to just go with it. I was just wondering who you are waiting for, she said. Must be someone really special, if not even I can keep your attention. What? Jiraiya said. Waiting on someone? Me? What gave you that idea? He then laughed while scratching the back of his head, obviously trying not to act suspicious. Sometimes Tsunade seriously wondered how that buffoon could be an excellent actor during missions while failing so spectacular in a more private setting. Sensei chuckled. I think she refers to your regular glances at the clock, Jiraiya. Was it that obvious? She chuckled. For everyone that knows you? Yes, it was. Both men snorted at that. There's no harm in telling you, I guess, Jiraiya said after taking a sip from his glass. I'm meeting my godson after this and I don't want to disappoint him by being late. I'm doing enough of that already as it is, no need to add to the list. You aren't doing too bad, Sensei consoled him while Tsunade blinked in surprise. You are a very busy man. With that in mind, you're doing all you can. That's not always enough, though. She felt as if there was more to that, but when he didn't continue, she didn't push. If there was someone who knew how it felt not wanting to talk about something, it was her. So, she said. I guess that's also the reason you didn't drink as much as usual. Well, I can't be completely wasted when dealing with a child, can I? Probably not the best idea if you ask me. I wish you would have been aware of that before I beat it into the thick head of yours. Tsunade gasped in disbelief at the old man's words before turning an incredulous look at Jiraiya. Please tell me you weren't drunk while with that brat. He winced. That was one time. Besides, nothing happened. Gods, she interrupted him before emptying her glass with a single gulp. The boy doesn't live with you, right? She turned towards Sarutobi. If he does, you better change that. Don't worry, he said, completely ignoring Jiraiya's indignant complaints in the background. The boy lives in the orphanage. Jiraiya only visits him whenever he is in the village. The man in question let his head drop onto his arms with a groan. The two of you are impossible. And you love us anyway. Anyway, he said as he raised his head again, completely ignoring their sensei's comment. It's almost time, so I should probably get going. Wanna come and meet him? She thought about it for a second before she nodded, ignoring the feeling of walking right into a trap. Sure, why not? Tsunade thought there was something liberating about walking through the streets of Konoha at night. While she had already accepted that returning wasn't as terrible as she had previously thought, there had still been a lump in her throat when she first came back. Talking to the people who had been unexpectedly excited to see her considering she had been gone for years had helped her avoiding to fall into a darker mood, but she had only so much patience to waste on dealing with crowds, so once she used a henge to hide herself, nothing stopped her mind from bringing up painful memories. Now, however, the night helped to mask the familiar building, making them almost look like the ones she had seen in countless other villages and towns over the years. Still familiar enough to be comfortable and yet distinctly different enough to dull the edge of her pain. Tsunade's current company probably helped as well, silent as they may be. Just an hour ago, she would have laughed about the image of a silent Jiraiya, but now she didn't have the energy to be anything but thankful. While she might blame the alcohol for her exhausted state, which was ludicrous considering she hadn't drunk that much compared to her usual consume, she knew that it was truly the place itself that got to her. It was just so mentally draining to be back here. However, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Being here in the heart of her home with the only two people from her childhood that she still had left and watching the starry sky on a cloudless night wasn't something she had thought she would do ever again. It was nice. If she was honest, this was probably the most peaceful she had been in a very long time. Ero Sennin. Ji-chan. It was just then that the peace was broken by a child's voice. Tsunade had half a mind to punish the brat, a blonde-haired boy wearing an orange kimono, for that, but when she saw him throwing himself into Jiraiya's waiting arms, the little anger she felt melted away. So that's his godson, then, she thought with a small smile. I guess that idiot must have done at least something right if the boy likes him that much. Well, isn't that cute, she chuckled before turning towards the boy that had accompanied the child. And who might you be? I'm Itachi Uchiha, he said with a bow, his ponytail falling over his shoulder in the process. It's a pleasure to meet you, Tsunade-sama. Uchiha, huh? That was somewhat of a surprise as she couldn't spot a single Uchiha emblem on his dark blue kimono. Considering that clan loved to put it everywhere, that was rather unusual. Tsunade didn't care much about the ancient feud between the Uchiha and Senju. She didn't even carry that surname anymore anyway. However, the countless triads of her granduncle during her youth had left their mark on her. Not so much in that she distrusted them, though, but in that she relived the annoyance she felt every time her granduncle brought them up all over again whenever she saw one. What business do you have with that brat? I was merely accompanying Naruto to meet Jiraiya. A child shouldn't walk around all on their own this late in the night, after all. He is calling him just Jiraiya? With no honorifics? And dash. Tsunade, Jiraiya interrupted her as he walked up to her side with one hand on the blonde boy's shoulder. There's no need to interrogate Itachi like this. I asked him to bring Naruto to me once his friends went home, that's all. A big grin appeared on his face. On that note, meet my godson. Tsunade, this little rascal is Naruto. Naruto, this is my former teammate Tsunade. I told you about her, remember? Nice to meet ya, the boy exclaimed with a way too loud voice. Tsunade hadn't interacted much with children since she left the village. There had simply been no reason to. After all, she spent much of her time in casinos and bars. Children rarely visited these kinds of places. However, when she did interact with them, it was usually because some people recognized her even after all these years and pleaded for her to help their sick children. More often than not, her healing was completely redundant as the children in question rarely had something worse than a fever, but she could never quite bring herself to say no to the worried parents. Either she let herself be talked into helping them or, in case the child in question had some kind of injury that involved blood, let Shizune handle the situation. What she was trying to say was that the few times she interacted with children, they were usually too weak to do much more than lie in their beds. If they spoke to her at all, it was in a tired and hoarse voice. Maybe it was the fact that being back in Konoha brought back a lot of memories she had suppressed for years now, maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it were both of these things together, but whatever it was, when she looked at the brightly grinning boy, his form was momentarily replaced by the image of Nawaki. So Jiraiya told you about me, huh, she said while trying to dispel the painful image, cursing inwardly at the slight crack in her voice. Not that anyone but Jiraiya or her sensei would notice, of course, but that was already bad enough. I hope he knew to keep his tongue in check. The grin on the boy's face, which had no business at all looking so similar to her brother's, became even wider. He said you're the best healer there is and the most beautiful woman in the world. Suddenly, his face shifted into a more thoughtful expression. Though I guess he hasn't seen you in a while either. You're a bit too old for that now, right? Whatever spell he had over her broke in an instant. He had said that so casual and innocently, clearly meaning every word of it and only voicing what he thought was a fact. Who do you think you are to call a woman old to her face? Before he could react, she flicked her finger against his forehead and made him fly backwards. Tsunade wasn't a monster, of course. Insult or not, she wouldn't actually hurt a child. Because of that, he flew only a few feet before landing on his ass with a surprised yelp, rubbing his forehead with one hand while using the other to steady himself. What the hell, Granny? Why did you do that? I wouldn't have done that if you knew your manners, you brat. I see Jiraiya has been a bad influence on you if that's how you treat people you have just met. Are you stupid? I thought Ero Sennin was lying when he said you have a temper like a devil, but looks like he was right. Her head swung around to glare at the white-haired man who was smart enough to instantly take a step back, knowing full well that he wasn't under the same protection as the child. Hey, calm down, yes? It was said in good fun, that's all. No need to get angry, Tsunade narrowed her eyes some more as she considered if it was worth it to punish Jiraiya as well, completely ignoring her sensei and the Uchiha boy who had distanced themselves from the spectacle and now watched it from further away, when she suddenly felt an incoming attack. All it took was a casual swing of her hand to deflect the punch to her face, which she quickly followed up by another weak flick to her blonde assailant's forehead that this time only made him stumble a few steps back instead of throwing him to the ground like before. Naruto, Jiraiya said with a slight grimace. Maybe don't attack her, alright? She's kinda out of your league. That would indeed be the smart thing to do. The boy wouldn't have any of it, however. Shut it, Ero Sennin. He pointed a finger at her. I'm gonna beat that witch's ass, just watch me. Unexpectedly, rather than making her even angrier, that proclamation actually made her laugh. You're want to beat me? Big words for a little wimp. Although it was certainly stupid, she had to hand it to him, saying something like that when he clearly knew who she was took some guts. But do you really think you can back them up? I'm one of the legendary Sannin, after all, while I assume you haven't even graduated from the academy yet. So what? I'm gonna become the strongest ninja the village has ever seen, Dadabiya. That means I can't let myself be stopped by an old bully like you. Something in her chest squeezed painfully at that while similar words from years past echoed in her ears, but she ignored all of that. The strongest ninja the village has ever seen. She snorted. Don't be ridiculous. Do you even know what that means, or what heights you need to reach for that dream to become true? I'm sure you don't even know how strong Jiraiya is once he stops goofing around and he is your godfather, not to mention the Hokage. My grandfather and the old man, she jerked her head in the direction of her sensei, both are called God of Shinobi, did you know that? He's over 60 years old and still could beat your ass in a second straight. That's what you're aiming to surpass. Then, much quieter, she added, dreams are foolish, and they never come true. Tsunade took great pleasure in seeing the doubt in the boy's eyes, only to be surprised when it vanished as fast as it appeared. Well, if the Hokage are really so strong, all I need to do is become the strongest Hokage ever. If I do that, even you will need to acknowledge me, right? Hey. I want to be like Grandpa someday. I will be honored with the name Hokage, because being Hokage is my dream. For the sake of everyone's safety. Ever since my sister died, that sole thought has sustained me. Becoming the Hokage is my dream. She involuntarily took a step back while all energy seemed to drain out of her. Naruto, on the other hand, continued without even noticing her changed mood. I will surpass Ero Sennin, Ji-chan, you, and even your grandfather. And once I'm the strongest, I will be able to protect everyone. The absolute conviction with which he said that and the complete trust in his own words, it was as if Tsunade had been thrown into the past to relieve Dan's and Noeka's proclamation all over again. Tsunade wanted to hate the boy for that, wanted to be angry with him for reminding her of ghosts that she had tried so long to forget, but she couldn't bring herself to do so. And how could it be any other way? Wouldn't hating that boy who was so similar to the people she had lost be in a way like betraying their memory? She couldn't stay here, so she didn't. Just like she had done all her life, she ran. Did I say something wrong? In any other situation, Hiruzen would have found it adorable and even admirable that Naruto found it in himself to worry about a person he had just fought with. However, after watching Tsunade getting so upset, he didn't find the energy to feel anything but sadness. "Don't worry," Jiraiya told the boy as he stepped back to his side. "You didn't. I think you just remind her of someone that died a long time ago." "Oh," the boy said. "So, should I apologize or?" His former student chuckled, though it sounded somewhat forced. "No, there's no need for that. In fact, what you have done might actually help her. At least that was the plan." Hiruzen had known that confronting Tsunade with her past through Naruto would wake memories she would probably prefer not to think about, but you couldn't overcome past trauma by ignoring it. Confronting what had hurt you was the first step towards recovery. That didn't make it any easier to watch her being in that state, of course. "Itake," Jiraiya said. "Would you mind accompanying Naruto home? I'm afraid I will be too busy tonight to spend time with him after all." "Of course. Thanks." Jiraiya then turned towards his godson. "Listen, Naruto, I'm Dash." "It's alright," the boy interrupted him. "I understand. You want to help her, right?" It was always amazing to see how observant children could be. "I do." Naruto grinned. "Good. That's what friends should do." Jiraiya nodded. "That it is." He and Hiruzen shared one short glance before his former student vanished in a shunshin. He sighed. No matter how much he wished to accompany the man and help him console Tsunade, Hiruzen knew that he wasn't as well suited for that task as Jiraiya. Right now, she needed a friend much more than a teacher. Furthermore, as the Hokage and therefore leader during the conflict that had costed Tsunade her loved ones, it wasn't unreasonable to think that his presence might actually be counterproductive right now. For all that she had never blamed him, people acted unreasonably and lashed out at others when they were hurt, and if there was one word that described Tsunade right now, it would be just that. All he could do right now was to hope Jiraiya could help her. He found Tsunade sitting on the railing of one of Konoha's highest buildings right in the center of the village, her head turned upwards to watch the stars. "You followed me, huh? I should have expected that. You never knew when to leave someone alone." Jiraiya hid his worry at her hollow voice and chuckled softly, much different to the usual boisterous laugh he preferred, as he sat down next to her. "With how upset you looked. Of course I followed you. You don't leave someone alone when they're like that. Even if I ask you to." "Yes, even then." Tsunade snorted. "So you know what's good for me even better than I do myself now." "Maybe not," admitted easily, making her turn towards him in surprise. "But even if I don't know for sure what's the best course of action, I can still try to do what I think is right. That's the only thing all of us can do." When Tsunade spoke this time, he was glad to hear that her voice sounded slightly more alive than before. "Look at you, trying to sound all wise like this. Finally trying to live up to the hype. Well, someone has to set a good example for the next generation, right?" She just shook her head before surprising him by crossing the distance between them and leaning her head against his shoulder. If there was one thing that showed him in how much pain she was, it was this. After all, the last time she had hugged him was when Dan. "Yeah, let's not think about that right now. Don't think I don't see what you and Sensei tried there," Tsunade said, her voice now somewhat muffled. "It's cruel to bring up bad memories like this, you know." He hesitated for a moment as he thought about the right words before deciding to just say whatever felt right. There was probably no perfect way to do this anyway, so he could just as well follow his own words and do what he thought was right. "And what exactly did we try?" While she didn't raise her head from his shoulder, he could feel her tense. "Seriously, Jiraiya? Bringing a kid that's so similar to Dash." Tsunade's voice trembled and she was forced to take a deep breath before she could continue. "A kid that's so similar to them in an effort to make me stay. That's low, even for you." A rueful smile crept up his face. "It is, yes. You knew that and did it anyway. Tell me, Tsunade, he said instead of answering her question. Do you think we were subtle? What? I asked you if you think Sensei and I were subtle in bringing you into contact with Naruto, he elaborated. Did we really manipulate you without you even realizing it? She was silent for a few seconds until. Don't play games with me. What are you getting at, Jiraiya? You say we set you up to meet Naruto in an attempt to make you stay in the village by counting on the fact that his similarity to Dan and Noeke, he ignored the way she flinched at these names, would convince you to do so. But tell me, does that work if you're aware of what we were doing? After all, if you know you're being manipulated, the trick is over, right? So you're saying you weren't trying to manipulate me because you weren't subtle about it? So what, you didn't try to make me stay here and all that was just in my head? Her voice was one of disbelief. No, Jiraiya confessed without hesitation. We want you to stay, and it's also true that we wanted you to meet Naruto because of his similarity to those two. However, we don't want to manipulate you into it. In the end, it must be your decision, not ours. I don't understand, Tsunade said, clearly lost. You say you don't want to manipulate me into staying, but your actions speak otherwise. This was the critical moment. So far, Tsunade had been too stuck in her grief to get angry, but Jiraiya could feel that this was about to change. If he said one wrong word, this conversation was over. Tsunade, he said slowly while turning his head to look into her eyes. Can I be completely honest with you? She hesitated for a second, caught off guard by the seriousness in his expression, before nodding. You say that Naruto is similar to Dan and Noeke, and that's not wrong. But if such similarity is all we wanted, we could have brought countless other children as well to fulfill the same role. He raised his hand to make her stop in her tracks when she opened her mouth to disagree, only continuing when he was sure she wouldn't interrupt him. It helps that he looks similar to Noeke, and that his dream is the same as his and Dan's. However, he isn't alone with that. There are literally thousands of children in this village who have big dreams as well, hundreds of which include becoming Hokage. Maybe not all of them have the same willpower as Naruto to strive for such a lofty goal in the long run, I will give you that, but they all have one thing in common, they have absolute confidence in their abilities to achieve their dream one day. They work hard with their dreams before their inner eyes, no matter whether that dream is something big like becoming Hokage or something objectively easier like being the best older sibling they could possibly be. They all sweat and bleed to achieve whatever they set out to do. And while there are doubtlessly many who will ultimately accept defeat, there will also always be those that don't give up until the very end. There are hundreds of little Narutos, Dans, and Noekis dreaming of the future all over the village right now, and the reason we brought Naruto to meet you was to remind you of that. Tsunade, there are so many people with bright hopes for the future, but all you seem to remember when you think of Konoha are the bad things when there is so much more. There was a profound silence when he finished, but Jiraiya didn't push her to reply immediately. He took the fact that her head was still on his shoulder as a good sign, though. It was almost 15 minutes later that Tsunade finally replied. You're full of shit, you know that. He suppressed a wince. Now that wasn't the reaction he had been hoping for. Tsunade dash. So what if they all share the same conviction and even the same dream? In the end, all of them will be disappointed. Sure, some might claim to be happy, claim that they have fulfilled their dreams, but they're lying. At best, they simply realized the impossibility of their goals and changed them to something achievable. They pretend to be happy with what they have to the outside world, but on the inside, they know full well that they have failed in what they truly wanted. They understand that choosing the second best is the most they can ever do because their true goal is forever out of their reach. She took her head off his shoulder to direct her gaze towards the few ant-like figures of people walking below them in the streets. Dreams are for fools. Jiraiya looked at her for a moment while he fought down the impulse to put an arm around her shoulder. He doubted she would react well to that right now. Were Dan and Noeke fools, then? Her head jerked around. Jiraiya dash. I asked you if I can be honest with you and you agreed, he reminded her before she could finish. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do. So, let me ask that again, do you think Dan and Noeke were fools? Were they blind idiots who followed dreams they could never achieve, that they never even stood a chance? Can you really look into my eyes and tell me you believe that? Tsunade opened her mouth, but no tone escaped her. She tried several times to say something, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't bring herself to say it. Just like he had thought. It was after her fifth attempt that she finally gave up and averted her eyes from him with a growl that sounded suspiciously like a sob, but not before he could catch a glimpse of the open anguish in them. "What does it even matter?" she said, her voice once again hollow. "They're dead, whether they were foolish or not will not change anything about that." "That's true, but letting that loss define the rest of your life will neither." She snorted, sounding more bitter than amused. "Oh, you think I don't know that?" Tsunade dash. "Do you think I'm not aware that others have lost their loved ones too? I don't think I'm special, Jiraiya. Many have lost even more than I but still go on with their lives. I know that just as I know that just running away will solve nothing, but that doesn't change how I feel. Just because I know that they wouldn't want me to waste my life like this doesn't mean that I can change the way I feel." He hesitated a moment before slowly putting his arm around her to pull her close, giving her more than enough time to turn the offer of comfort down. She didn't. "I just want to hold them in my arms one more time." When it became clear she was done with swallowing all her hurt down and he heard her openly sob into his side, Jiraiya fully realized in just how much pain she really was. Tsunade only ever cried when she was at an extremely low point. In fact, this was actually only the third time he could remember her crying at all. When he spoke next, he kept his words slow and steady. "Even when someone dies, they're never truly gone. Just like we carry the will and dreams and ideals of our sensei and the generations before us, there will always be people who carry on the beliefs and hopes of the people we have lost. Even if you extinguish their light, there's no way that their flame will ever burn out. That's the will of fire." Tsunade knew that as well, of course, but he thought she needed to hear it nonetheless. Jiraiya could feel the wetness of his clothes when she pressed her face harder into his shoulder. "That's not enough for me. And it never will be. When someone dies, they will forever leave a hole in our hearts where they were supposed to be. All we can do is live on to the best of our abilities. If not for ourselves, then at least for them." "And how do you do it?" When she raised her head again to look him in the eyes, Jiraiya could see the conflicting emotions in hers. There was the well-expected pain and sorrow, of course, but what gave him hope was the almost desperate wish for an answer. "There is this one phrase I once read," he said. "Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times." He chuckled softly. "It's simple, but there is some truth for it. However, what I think the person who wrote this didn't understand is that if the strong men try hard enough, they should be able to achieve something akin to permanent peace. There will always be problems and crises, of course, but their extent can be limited. Just think about it, a mere century ago, the entire continent was in a constant state of war. No area was unaffected, no one knew peace. The loss of loved ones wasn't a heartbreaking tragedy but a reality of everyday life. Then your grandfather came along and brought that age to an end. Yes, there are still wars, but honestly, compared to the past, having only 3 major conflicts in a century is a great improvement. If you were to travel back in time and tell the people of that period about it, they wouldn't believe you and call you crazy. After all, a world not trying to tear itself apart all the time? Preposterous. However, your grandfather didn't let himself be stopped by such beliefs and went on to make peace with the Uchiha, made friends out of enemies, founded this village, and inspired others to do the same. Today, people live longer than ever before in recorded history, much more children are allowed to have actual childhoods, and families don't need to constantly be afraid of losing one another. The world we live in isn't perfect by any means, but it is better than what it was before. You want to know how I managed to live on? I strive to make the world of tomorrow even better than what it is today. I do my best to clean the messes our generation has made to stop them from becoming a problem in the future. I pass on what I have learned, and I have trust that the people that follow us will do the same. I have hope that this world will get better bit by bit with every generation until ultimately, there will be peace." That was what Jiraiya honestly believed. The great Toad Sage had foretold that a student of his would be a force of great change in the world, but he knew that this one person alone wouldn't be enough to bring peace. However, If they could bring others to their side, to open other people's hearts to their cause, they could be the source of a revolution that would ultimately bring peace to the ninja world. Such a thing couldn't be done in one lifetime, but creating the foundation on which future generations could build on. Now that was more than possible. It was notable to mention that the aforementioned abilities were skills Naruto already possessed. "You said we tried to manipulate you," he said, bringing up the topic from the beginning of their conversation. "And in a way, that's probably true. It might not have been our intention, but a case can be made that it happened anyway. However, what we wanted to do was to give you the chance to choose. Regardless of whether you decide to stay or to leave after this, we want you to make this decision not only in the form of an emotional affect, but as a result of rational consideration. But to do that, you need to know and understand both sides of the argument. That's what this whole thing has been about. If you now decide to stay here, you will no longer be burdened by the ghosts of your past because they will have become your strength instead. On the other hand, if you choose to leave Konoha, it will not be an escape. You will no longer be running from your past, but instead walking towards a new future. No matter what you ultimately decide, you will be free to look towards tomorrow instead of remaining stuck in yesterday." That was it. Jiraiya had no more to say, and now it was up to Tsunade to make a decision. They kept sitting like that for hours, with her leaning against his shoulder and his arm around her waist, as they watched the starry sky slowly give way for the rising sun in the east. He didn't pressure her and gave her all the time she needed to come to an answer. If necessary, he was ready to sit here for days. As long as Tsunade found comfort in his presence, he wouldn't leave her alone. What she had said was true. Even if you knew that your emotions were irrational and went against all logic, you couldn't just change them at will. You did not decide how you felt. Sure, it was possible to put emotions aside for a while, but in the end, they always came back. Tsunade was actually a good example of that. She had wandered the continent for many years, filling her time with gambling and alcohol that helped her forget, but in the end, her emotions caught up with her, leading to this very moment right now. Jiraiya couldn't really blame her for running away, though. Not when he had apparently done the same in an alternative timeline and would have done it again in this one hadn't it been for his sensei and Itachi sharing the latter's tale with him. In the end, humans were weak creatures. When a rare strong person appeared, they latched onto them for strength and support, looked at them for advice and leadership, and depended on them for safety. On the other hand, when this strong person turned out to be malicious in nature and there was no other strong person to protect the people from them, humans banded together to find strength in numbers. Yes, humans on their own were weak, but when they created bonds with others, they became strong. If humankind one day truly managed to put its quarrels and disputes aside and allowed peace to settle into the lands, there was nothing they couldn't do. It was in the early morning hours that Tsunade finally made her decision. "I guess I should pay a visit to the hospital first to see how much the standards have fallen in my absence, don't you think?" Chapter 30, Ryokai Cave. Let's start this from the beginning. Ryokai Cave. 1 month after leaving Konoha. Anko had no illusions about the odds of her actually finding Ryokai Cave. In all likelihood, she would either spend the rest of her life searching for it or give up on this endeavor after some years and return to Konoha as a failure. There simply was no in-between. But she also realized that this was the only way that might save her from being left behind. She herself had been called talented, prodigious even, since her earliest childhood. That was why Orochimaru, one of Konoha's most powerful shinobi, had been willing to take her as an apprentice. And while it never came to that because it turned out her sensei was a slimy bastard who fled the village when it came out that he experimented on humans and even babes, the point still stood that someone of his caliber saw enough potential in her to warrant personal interest. However, whatever talent she possessed paled compared to Itachi's. Next to him, she was average at best. That wasn't even an insult. Being called average compared to someone who could do what Itachi did when he was just 7 years old was in fact a compliment. That didn't change the fact that Anko didn't want to fall behind him, though. He, Yukio, and she were teammates. They were supposed to have each other's backs. Especially now after Yukio had confessed to her that he considered giving up on being a shinobi altogether, was it important that she got strong enough to cover Itachi for them both. Sure, she knew that the younger boy had other friends as well, members of his clan that would look out for him if she couldn't, but Anko wasn't about to give up that easily. No, the only path she accepted for herself was one where she became strong enough to stand at his side. Teams were like a family, especially those that had been formed between academy graduates, and while Itaki had joined them only later, he was just as much part of it as Yukio, Tanaka-sensei, and she herself. In her case, they were literally the only family she ever had, so there was no way she would become a burden. Furthermore, Anko still intended to get revenge on Orochimaru for his betrayal. The Sunin was far stronger than any other enemy she had ever fought, and she knew that she didn't stand a chance against him as she was now. If she were completely honest with herself, she would probably never stand a chance against him either if she didn't take extraordinary steps to improve herself. The Chunin exams demonstrated how strong even enemies her own age could be. If she couldn't even beat them, how could she ever hope to bring Orochimaru to justice? The best solution to all her problems was to find Ryokai Cave and train under the White Snake Sage. That was unfortunately easier said than done, however. Anko had even tried asking her summons to lead her there, but just as she had expected, they had refused. Apparently finding the way on their own was part of the test anyone who wanted to train under the sage needed to pass. That meant she had no other choice but to wander through the continent with no clue whatsoever whether she was getting closer or not, basically hoping to just randomly stumble into it. They're still snakes, she thought. That means they can't live just about everywhere. The climate must meet certain conditions to be a potential home to them, so I can exclude at least some places. Not nearly as many as I would like, but it's a start. Who knew? Maybe she was lucky and really just ran into it within a few weeks. Now, wouldn't that be something? 3 months after leaving Konoha. Unfortunately, she was not so lucky. With no other choice left, Anko decided to begin her search within the borders of the Land of Fire. The idea was that she would at least not need to deal with enemy shinobi this way. If she didn't find the cave here, however, she would be forced to look elsewhere and therefore enter foreign countries. She really didn't look forward to hiding from patrols all the damn time. The problem with searching for it in the Land of Fire was that there were a lot of places far enough away from any hotspot of civilization to possibly hide the cave. And as the entire country offered great conditions for snakes, Anko couldn't even limit the area she needed to look by taking that point into consideration. The best thing she could do was asking in small, local villages and towns whether they had noticed an unusual number of snakes or if there were any folk tales about them in the region. So far, her search hadn't yielded any results yet. No, the only things Anko had found were countless insects that decided to nest in her sleeping back and hair as well as a newfound appreciation for baths. 9 months after leaving Konoha. She had known from the very beginning that there wouldn't be much for her to do during her travels, but Anko noticed mere days into her journey that it was even more boring than she could have ever predicted. Thus, with no other choice if she didn't want to die from boredom, she did the one thing she had always hated to do. She studied. Now, don't understand her wrong. She did study a lot in her life. The expectations that she and later Orochimaru set for herself didn't allow Anko to slack off. However, she initially was content with just mastering whatever was expected of her and never expanding on that on her own, the only recent exception being when she went out of her way to create a poison that wouldn't easily vaporize in flames for the Chunin exams. This far away from home, with no one to keep her busy and nothing else to do, she burrowed herself once again in her studies. Fortunately, the Sandaime had allowed her to bring copies of Orochimaru's notes with her. That, together with various books she brought, she could keep herself at least somewhat busy during her journey. And honestly, once she actually began to read, she found it quite interesting. Sure, a lot of her former sensei's experiments described in the notes were disgusting, but there was no denying that the information he got out of them were groundbreaking. If you asked Anko, the least thing they could do was to use this information to do something good with them and maybe give the victims some peace in the knowledge that their suffering wasn't for naught. Furthermore, if this information somehow helped Anko in ultimately bringing Orochimaru down, they would also indirectly get their revenge on him through her. She knew that if she were in their position, she would like that idea. Unfortunately, no matter how hard she tried to take her time going through the various materials, there came a point where there was nothing new left for her to read. Even writing her own notes down and cross-referring between the different sources only slowed her down that much. I probably should buy some more books, she thought. Let's hope the next bookstore I find actually has something useful to offer rather than just fictional stories. Though to be honest, Anko would probably get some of these as well. Not like she had anything better to do anyway, and even a mediocre story was still better than staring holes into the air. With that in mind, she continued walking westwards until she finally crossed into the land of rivers. 1.5 years after leaving Konoha. The highlight of every day was doubtlessly the training session in the evening. And although it was almost impossible to increase your own taijutsu skills by training on your own, Anko found a few ways she could improve herself even in face of that. For one thing, she began to wear weights. She wasn't so stupid as to overdo it like that weirdo guy, of course, but she was confident that they would increase her speed and strength over time. If she continued to increase the burden little by little and if her search continued for as long as she feared it would, there should be quite the improvement when she finally returned to Konoha. Another thing she did was to train with her clones. However, the only thing they were really good for was to test new techniques because in the end, they were exactly as strong, fast, and skilled as she was. Handicapping herself made up for that somewhat, but even that wasn't enough to truly help her train. Anko also tried to incorporate new attacks into her katas by looking for inspiration in the various books and notes she had with her. Whenever she stumbled over a weak point in the human body that none of her attacks already targeted, she tried her best to change that. Concerning the other ninja arts, well, genjutsu had never been something she was interested in. Training with Itaka meant she was forced to learn combating it, and it had also allowed her to pick up a thing or two about it as well, but that was it. The thing she could train best was ninjutsu. There were quite a lot of jutsu she technically knew but had never mastered, including but not limited to techniques she had seen Orochimaru use before he became a traitor. Now that she had so much free time at hand, she spent countless hours trying and eventually mastering as many of them as she could. There were quite a few of them she didn't get the hang of, unfortunately, and she assumed she would never be able to master them without someone else directly teaching them to her, but those she did master quickly became powerful aces in her arsenal. Another thing she could also train even as she traveled was the speed with which she weaved hand signs. It didn't cost her any chakra, kept her hands busy, and was something she could do practically all the time. All in all, she counted this as an absolute win. At this point, she was quite confident that everyone who didn't possess the Sharingan would struggle to predict what technique she was to unleash on them. That should give her a little edge even against otherwise superior opponents. However, no matter how much Anko improved, nothing could distract her from the fact that she had been away from her home for 18 months now and still had nothing to show for it. It was one thing to be prepared to spend years on the road, but something entirely different to actually do it. It might have been easier to endure if she could at least communicate with her friends, but alas, the best thing she could do was sending them letters. Receiving them in return was pretty much impossible, though one of Itaka's crows had managed to find her once. With a sigh, Anko cast these dark thoughts aside and continued her journey northwards, forming hand signs all the time. 3 years after leaving Konoha. She was a few miles away from the border to the Land of Wind when she saw a large cloud of black smoke rise into the sky. Now, this was a foreign land filled with foreign people. Anko had no duty to anyone that lived here, nothing that would force her to intervene in whatever was going on. That being said, she also knew that this region of the Land of Rivers was poor and far away from the nearest city. It was unlikely that any other aid would arrive in time to help the people living here. Without hesitation, Anko began to run. It wasn't before long that she began to hear people screaming, though were it just that, she might have continued to hope that all she was going to find were people trying to extinguish a house that had caught fire or something like that. However, Anko was unfortunately all too familiar with the sound of crashing metal and the crazy laugh of men that enjoyed the slaughter of innocents, so she had no illusions regarding what was happening. Her expectations were met a moment later when she came into sight of the little town. People in tattered and flicked clothes ran for their lives while brutish-looking men hunted after them, swinging their weapons above their heads and hollering jeers and insults towards their prey. There were already countless corpses spotting the area, from old men to mothers with their children. No one had been spared so far, and Anko doubted the assailants planned to change that approach any time soon. Anko had no intention of being any more merciful with them than they were with the townspeople. She didn't know how many enemies there were, but it hardly mattered. None of them appeared to be shinobi and thus none of them was a threat to her. So, confident in her own superiority and with anger burning in her stomach, she jumped into the fight. The first few bandits didn't even realize what was going on before they died. Two of them were running after a young girl with what must be a younger sibling in her arms when Anko appeared next to him and drove a kunai through his throat. The other one was a few steps behind and too close to stop, so before his brain even caught up with the events, she took the fallen bandit's rusty sword to end his comrade's life with it as well. Instead of stopping there, she spun around and threw the weapon, instantly killing a bandit a few dozen meters away that was just about to do the same to an old man that sat on the ground in front of him. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Shadow Clone Technique. Half a second after making the necessary hand seals, half a dozen versions of her rushed into different directions to save as many people as possible. One man that had cornered a girl in an alley suddenly found his head bashed against the stone wall to his right before being thrown backwards into one of his comrades. Befuddled as he was by the attack, he didn't even get to scream before a fireball consumed them both. Another group of 5 were running after a family of 3 when Anko appeared between the two parties. The bandits, not judging her a threat, only laughed harder and rushed at her, making it all the easier for her summoned snakes to kill the first 4 by sinking their fangs into their throats. The 5th one, being fortunate enough to be a bit behind, managed to come to a stop before the same could happen to him, but he was still too slow to dodge the kunai that sunk into his forehead a second later. A few smarter ones were realizing what was happening and tried to flee, but all it took to stop them was a simple earth wall to block their path. None of them survived long enough to search for another way out. However, she and her clones didn't just target the aggressors but also helped the residents. An old woman buried under some fallen over cart had already given up hope when Anko appeared and pushed the vehicle off her. A young couple trapped in a burning building and almost unconscious from all the smoke cried in relief when she broke through the wall, extinguished the flames in their path, and then carried them to safety. The most challenging thing that happened was when she found a middle-aged man with a slash wound on his chest. He was still alive and the injury wasn't as bad as it could have, but it was still the worst wound she had ever attempted to heal. Never had she been more thankful for reading the notes Orochimaru had left behind, as for all that many of them contained gruesome content. The information regarding how to keep prisoners alive for as long as possible while experimenting on them could also be used for situations like this. I should try to get my hands on some real books about healing, though. Who knows when that will become handy. In the end, Anko couldn't save everyone. She appeared too late for that. But even if she had arrived earlier, she couldn't be everywhere at once, so she decided to be grateful for having been able to help as many as she did instead of crying for those that had died. It was thanks to her interference that there were still enough people left to rebuild, so it wasn't as if nothing good came out of this. The people would mourn for the dead, yes, but they would recover and continue to live from these lands as they had done for generations. None of the bandits survived, of course. Anko stayed at the destroyed town for almost a week to help with burying the corpses, rebuilding the houses, and healing the injured. She didn't need to, but she did it anyway. She was rewarded for that in the end when it turned out that one of the townspeople, an old man that once traveled the continent as a merchant, knew a housewife's tale about a kingdom where gigantic snakes rule supreme. He was more than willing to share with her. It wasn't much, but considering it was also the first real clue she got, Anko was unsurprisingly excited to continue her journey. She departed the very next day. 4.5 years after leaving Konoha. The Land of Birds wouldn't have been her first guess regarding the location of Ryokai Cave. Nonetheless, once she was there, she became more and more convinced that she was getting closer and closer. The country was located between the lands of Earth and Wind, but it had much more in common with the former than the latter. The main difference, however, was that instead of being spotted with rocky mountains and bare hills everywhere, the mountains here formed hundreds of valleys with abundant vegetation and dense forests. Befitting its name, there were also birds everywhere. Day and night, their twitters could be heard no matter where you were, almost driving Anko crazy with their constant noise. It took all the self-control she had to not constantly kill every bird she got across. The problem was that the area made it extremely hard to effectively search for that stupid cave. Ever since she managed to get here a bit over a year ago, escaping Suna patrols that weren't happy about an unknown stranger in their lands in the process, she fought her way through almost impassable mountain ranges and all-encompassing forests, but no matter how hard she tried, progress was slow. Anko was just about to cut her way through some particularly stubborn undergrowth when her body reacted on instinct and jumped aside, saving her of the unpleasant experience of having a snake plunging her fangs into her ankles. "Hey," she exclaimed angrily. "What did I do to you, asshole? Leave me alone." Initially, she had been happy about the insane number of snakes in the country and took it as confirmation that she was close to her goal, but she quickly grew annoyed at them for constantly attacking her. Were she not afraid of offending the white snake sage, she would squash every single one of them. Fortunately, the snake did what she told it and slithered away after one last hiss. Unfortunately, it was only then that Anko realized that the snake had been bone white. "Damn it," she cursed under her breath before hurrying in the direction the snake had vanished. "Hey, come back. I didn't mean it like that, I promise." For all that she had seen thousands of snakes since entering this country, this was the first time she had seen one with that specific coloring. In fact, this was the first time seeing a white snake since Orochimaru had left the village. Now, that could just be a coincidence, of course. Albinos were after all known to plop up from time to time. However, if what Anko believed was true, this snake might actually lead her to Ryokai Cave. Its unique color had the advantage that it stood out from the rest of the environment and thus allowed Anko to spot it a few seconds into the hunt. That should have been the end of it. After all, there was no way that a small snake like that could escape a shinobi like her. However, to Anko's never-ending frustration, the thick vegetation meant she couldn't move as quickly as she would have liked to, while the snake with its smaller body could easily wriggle through obstacles without even slowing down. Anko let out a frustrated cry as she jumped straight through some brushwood, ignoring the way its branches shredded her clothes and cut through her skin. All that didn't matter to her as long as she managed to keep her eyes on that annoyingly nimble snake. She had no idea how long she ran after it, but when she finally broke through the tree line into the open just a dozen meters away from the wall of one of the mountains that encircled the valley, her entire body was covered with scratches. It had been worth it, though, as she had managed to stay close enough to her target to see its white form vanish into a nearby tunnel. "Gotcha!" She immediately rushed after it, excitement bubbling in her chest at the thought that this was it, only to come to an abrupt halt when she crossed the entrance and came face to face with a veil of darkness and, more notably, a lack of white snakes. "Oh, come on. Seriously?" Seeing no other way, she slowly walked in. Running would have naturally been preferable, but no matter how anxious she might be, Anko wasn't stupid enough to run when she could barely see her own hands in front of her face. Walking into what could possibly be the lair of some predator like this was stupid enough, no need to risk falling to her death because she overlooked some hole in the ground. She wandered through the darkness for what felt like hours, though it were probably only minutes. Anko had no way to know for sure, however, keeping track of time in such an environment was almost impossible. Then, when she finally saw light at the end of the tunnel, she was disappointed to note that what was on the other end was not the fabled home of the white snake sage but just another valley. The white snake she had followed hadn't made another appearance either. However, what made this valley at least somewhat interesting was the modest housing that stood barely 100 meters from her position at the exit of the tunnel. This wasn't the first time she had encountered people in this country, of course. For all that it was relatively sparsely inhabited, there were villages and towns, and while she hadn't been there herself, she knew that the capital was said to be rather impressive. All that being said, most of the lands were firmly in the hands of nature. Anko had spent over 1 year here and so far only found one single village and half a dozen families living on their own at remote locations. Decision made, she moved towards the building with deliberate steps. She didn't have any trouble with the people of this country yet, but in her opinion, no one who lived this far out here on their own could be completely sane. Humans simply needed some contact with other humans if they didn't want to wilt away. Her attention snapped to the door when a person stepped out. "Oh my," the woman said with a friendly smile. "What a wonderful surprise. It has been a while since we had a visitor. Say, what are you doing here all on your own, my dear? Don't you know that it's dangerous to travel all on your own?" The woman appeared to be in her late 50s, with hair that was more gray than black in a forward-bent stance. She wore simple black robes that were stitched at several places, and going by the calluses on her hand and the sun-kissed, wrinkled skin, she had spent a lot of her life outside. All in all, she looked just like every other inhabitant of this country she had met so far. Furthermore, while she tried to hide it, Anko could see the tension in her limbs and the apprehension in her eyes. Everything pointed at her being afraid of Anko and what she would do to her. Not unreasonable considering civilians were pretty much defenseless against a shinobi. There was nothing this woman could do to stop Anko if she had bad intentions. "I can defend myself just fine," she replied, making sure to stand as unthreatening as possible while keeping her voice calm. "I'm just exploring the region and stumbled over your home by accident. I mean no trouble." The woman relaxed. Anko could be lying, of course, and she obviously did, but she had no need to trick her as she was already superior in every single aspect. To her, that meant that Anko must be telling the truth. Exploring the area? That must be so very exhausting. Our country is lovely, but the vegetation and all these steep hillsides, she shook her head. These days, we can't even travel to the nearest village on our own anymore. I'm terribly sorry, Anko said as sincerely as she could. That sounds very harsh. The woman waved her off. Oh, don't you worry, my dear. You get used to it. Now, why don't you come in, clean a bit up, and let us give you something to drink. It's such a hot day, and forgive us for pointing that out, you look terrible. Anko looked down her body to see that running through the underbrush in her pursuit of that white snake had done more damage than she initially thought. While the scratches themselves were harmless in and of themselves, there were a lot of them. None has bled too much, but as she was literally covered in them, her clothes were full of blood stains. And anyway, she thought as she looked upwards with a frown. It is very hot today. I must have been too distracted by that snake to notice, I guess. I would really appreciate it, ahem. Our name is Tagorium, but please, call us Oba-san. She gave the woman a warm smile. Of course, Oba-san. The house was just as modest from the inside as from the outside. There was one large room that seemed to serve as the living space and had one door leading to what Anko assumed would be Tagorium's bedroom. As there was no other door, you probably had to do your business outside. Anko moved to the middle of the room and sat down on a cushion the other women's pointed at before gratefully accepting the offered cup of water and taking a large gulp. Anko sighed in delight. I really needed that. Thank you, Oba-san. She gave her a grandmotherly smile. Oh, there's no need for that. Now, just wait here while we get you something new to wear. You really can't walk around in such tattered clothes, you know. It's indecent. Anko chuckled. Of course, of course. You're right, it would be really embarrassing if someone saw me like this. She would honestly find it more hilarious than embarrassing, but there was no need to say that out loud. Anko watched Tagorium move into the adjoining room with an amused smile before redirecting her gaze towards the cup in her hands. She then twirled it for a few seconds with a thoughtful look before drinking the rest of it in one go. For the first time in months, Anko felt truly refreshed and comfortable as a pleasant warmth spread through her body. Finding her sitting position too inconvenient, she first stretched her limbs before burrowing her head onto her arms on the table in front of her. After such a long day, it was probably normal to feel tired, and closing her eyes for a few seconds until Tagorium came back shouldn't be a problem, right? The room stayed silent for several minutes until the owner of the house finally returned. Slowly but steadily, she came closer and closer, the only sound being the quiet creaking of the wooden floor beneath her. Her eyes, previously warm and kind, were now cold and calculating as she lowered her head towards the crumbled form in front of her, mouth wide open and ready to. Before she had the chance to react, Anko moved and sent a mule kick to her chest. A second later, a serpentine body crashed against the wall with a boom. Seriously, Anko said with a smug smile. You didn't honestly think I would fall for that, did you? Tagorium, her grandmotherly appearance now replaced by that of a big, black snake with white accents, hissed at her in apparent anger. You drank the water, I know you did. Her voice was much higher and shriller than before. How dash? Did I? She took the cup from the table behind her without breaking eye contact and held it in a way that allowed her opponent to see the liquid inside of it. You really should pay closer attention to your wannabe victims. I hate to break it to you, but it's really embarrassing to fall for someone else's genjutsu when your own trap is based on one. The rage the thing's eyes was impossible to miss. You little dash. Oh, and by the way, Anko interrupted her before summoning a kunao into her hand and swinging it in one smooth arc to her left, seemingly aiming it at empty air. You also shouldn't try something that already failed a second time, nor fall for the same thing twice. Really, such things make you look like an amateur. Anko put the cup back on the table before using her now free hand to form a one-handed ram seal. Release. At her command, her surroundings began to disappear bit by bit while the illusion her opponent had tried to impose on her fell away from her mind like wallpaper peeling off a wall. The house itself and all the furniture inside it aside from the table behind her with the cup of water faded away, and even the valley it had been located in was replaced by a rocky ground and walls of stone that came together in a roof far above her head. However, maybe the most interesting change was the fact that Anko's kunao no longer pointed at empty air but straight at the yellow eye of another snake. Impossible, the brown reptile hissed, its voice much deeper than Tagorium's. You saw through my genjutsu as well. Anko shrugged casually in false modesty. It wasn't that hard. Obasan over there referring to herself as us all the time made it kind of obvious that she had either an accomplice or was insane. Being a shinobi and all that, I obviously assumed the former just to be safe. She smirked. Also, I have a teammate who is much more talented in genjutsu than either of you two. Compared to his techniques, yours were laughable weak. Both snakes were obviously inaudibly unhappy with her statement, but Anko didn't care. What she found much more interesting was the fact that where the tails of both snakes should be, they instead connected with each other, meaning it was actually just a single entity rather than two. You know, I always thought Amphisbaena 1 were just a legend. Who would have thought you actually exist? Not many find their way to us. And even less ever have the chance to tell the tale. Alright, Anko though. I gotta admit, it's kinda creepy if they talk like that. Outwardly, she chuckled. Is that so? I take it then that not many pass this little test of yours. She gave both heads a piercing look. That's what this is, right? A test to see who can pass and who can't. The two heads turned to look at each other. Does that mean they can't communicate with their minds, before simultaneously turning back at her? Congratulations, Anko Mitarashi, for you have passed. Congratulations, Anko Mitarashi, for you have passed. As if on command, the earth rumbled as the wall not too far away from her gave way to reveal the entrance to another tunnel, and even from her position, she could feel strong chakra pouring from its other end. Anko's expression turned into a genuine smile. At last, she had found Ryokai Cave. Check the description for the links to the author.